I can translate it. Annie Brooks's voice was small, clear, and completely out of place in the Halbrook library. Charles Halbrook lifted his eyes from the leather-bound record and stared at the girl standing beside her mother against the back wall. "Annie," he said at last, measured and firm, "you're too young. This isn't a joke, and it certainly isn't a game." Before Annie could answer, Helen Ward, Charles's wife, set down her coffee cup with a quiet click. "She shouldn't be involved at all," she said. "This is a family matter." Vivian Halbrook Mercer, Charles's younger sister, leaned in at once. "Exactly. With respect, Charles, this is not something for outsiders. We cannot let the staff become part of a private inheritance discussion." Lila Brooks lowered her head instantly. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice soft and controlled. She didn't mean to interrupt. Annie felt her mother's fingers tighten on her shoulder, but Annie did not take back what she had said. "I'm not joking, sir," Annie said. Charles folded his hands. "And why?" he asked, still calm. "Do you think you can translate something scholars haven't been able to read for decades?" Annie swallowed, then answered with the complete sincerity only a child could carry into a room full of suspicious adults. "Because my grandpa taught me how to tell when a mark is a letter, and when it's a secret pretending not to be one." Annie kept going. "My grandpa was an archaeologist," she said. "He showed me old hand-copied notes and symbol maps and trademarks and things people used when they didn't want strangers to understand what they wrote. He said some secrets hide in plain sight if everybody around them is too proud to look close." That drew a reaction. Vivian's brows rose. Helen's mouth tightened. Robert muttered, "Good Lord." But Charles did not interrupt. Annie took a breath. "If you let me have a piece of paper, I can show you." Lila bent immediately. "Annie, no." "Please, Mama." Annie's voice dropped, gentle, rather than defiant. "Just one paper." The room shifted. It was one thing for a child to make a claim. It was another for her to ask to demonstrate it. Price finally spoke. "Mr. Halbrook, allowing the child to illustrate what she means would not alter the order of proceedings." Helen turned toward him sharply. "Edwin, I'm only saying," Price replied, "that a drawing is not an interpretation. It is, at worst, a delay of 1 minute." Robert scoffed. "And at best?" Price adjusted one cuff. "At best, we discover whether the child is observant." Charles looked at Annie for a long moment. He was not a sentimental man, and nothing in his expression suggested indulgence. But he was curious now, though he tried not to show it. "One sheet," he said. "And then this meeting proceeds." Samuel Pike moved before anyone else did. From a writing desk near the window, he retrieved a cream-colored sheet of stationery and a fountain pen, then hesitated and exchanged the pen for a pencil. He brought both to Annie with the quiet gravity of a man setting out instruments for something he did not wish to insult. "Thank you, Mr. Pike," Annie said. He gave the smallest nod. "You're welcome, miss." Samuel placed a chair beside the table. It was too tall for Annie, and when she climbed onto it, her shoes could not quite find the rung at first. Lila moved instinctively to help, but Annie had already steadied herself. Standing there in her blue cardigan, with the pencil in one small hand and all those wealthy adults staring at her, she looked both impossibly little and strangely composed. She bent over the paper. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the scratching of pencil lead and the rain outside. Then Annie straightened and turned the page around. "There," she said. On the sheet were 5 simple symbols, copied neatly in a child's hand. "What is no? Oak. WW. The common see what discovered." Therefore, Robert stared at them and gave another laugh, but it was weaker this time. "What exactly are we looking at?" Annie pointed to the first mark, a curved shape like a bent neck. "This one looks like a bird," she said. "But it's not bird. Not always. Sometimes it means watch or keep watch, especially if it bends backward. Grandpa said when a sign looks behind itself, it usually means somebody didn't trust what was coming next." She moved to the second symbol, a circle with 2 dots beside it. "This one isn't decoration. It means the line doesn't belong where it sits. It tells you to read around it, not through it, like the sentence is hiding behind itself." Her finger tapped the third mark, a little arch beside a straight line. "This one can mean key, but not a key you hold. More like the truth you need before something makes sense." She tapped the star. Grandpa said a star in a private family code can mean a name they don't want to write out loud. Then she pointed to the final symbol. 3 dots in a small triangle. And this means there's another meaning under the first meaning. Like if somebody wanted their own family to understand, but not strangers. No one interrupted. Charles's eyes had moved from Annie's face to the page, and they stayed there. Price stepped closer without meaning to. Where? He asked carefully. Have you seen these before? Annie turned and pointed, not to the open page, but to the leather cover of the family record itself. On the edge, she said. Very little. Pressed in. The bird mark is near the spine. The 3 dots are by the corner, and there's a broken key shape under the strapline. They're old, but they're there. Samuel Pike inhaled softly. It was the first real sound of surprise in the room. Charles looked up at him. You saw them? Samuel answered with the honesty of old service. No, sir. I did not. But I believe the child did. Vivian rose halfway out of her chair. This proves nothing except that she has imagination. No, ma'am, Annie said politely, and every adult in the room seemed startled by the calm certainty in her voice. If it was imagination, I would have made prettier symbols. So Annie lifted her chin and spoke more softly. I don't want to cause trouble, she said. I just know that book isn't written regular. It's written like somebody wanted the wrong people to give up. Charles Halbrook leaned back in his chair. Then, very slowly, Charles looked at Edwin Price. How long? He asked. Would it take for her to prove whether she's guessing? Price studied Annie's paper, then the leather record, then Annie herself. That depends, he said, on whether you want to know the answer or whether you only want the room kept comfortable. No one liked that, which was precisely why no one challenged it. Charles's gaze returned to Annie. At last, he said, All right, Annie. Show us what you see. And for the first time since entering the Halbrook Library that rainy October morning, Annie Brooks felt the old secret on the table turn toward her like something waking up. Charles Halbrook kept his eyes on Annie for a long moment. Then Charles made the decision. Let her do it, he said. Helen turned to him at once. Charles. He lifted one hand, not sharply, but with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to ending arguments before they formed. Let Annie translate the record. Vivian stared at him. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. Robert gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You're going to hand over the family's most private document to her? Charles's expression hardened. I'm going to allow the only person in this room who has recognized its structure to speak. That silenced Robert for a beat, though not with grace. Edwin Price adjusted his spectacles and looked at Annie with a new kind of care. Not belief, not yet, but no longer dismissal. If we proceed, he said, we proceed in order. The child reads aloud. I record. No interruptions, unless clarification is necessary. Helen folded her hands tightly in her lap. This is becoming absurd. No, Charles said, still watching Annie. Absurd would be ignoring what's right in front of us because it arrived in the wrong package. Annie placed her pencil down. May I hold it, sir? She asked. The question itself changed the room again. Price looked to Charles. Charles gave a single nod. Yes, carefully. Samuel stepped forward first, not because he doubted Annie, but because he understood the weight of ceremony. He drew the old leather record toward the lamp, then gently turned it so Annie could reach it more easily from the tall chair. Price removed one glove and offered his bare hand beneath the bottom edge in case the book slipped. It did not. Annie lifted the record with both hands. It was heavier than she had expected. Not in size, but in feeling. The leather was cool and slightly rough beneath her fingers. The boards creaked softly as she opened it wider, and the pages gave off that dry, time-worn scent she had loved since sitting beside her grandfather among stacks of copied notes, old museum pamphlets, and field journals full of symbols that looked like puzzles until he taught her they were really choices. She lowered her gaze to the first page. The room waited. Annie spoke quietly at first, but every word came clear. This isn't written to be read straight across, she said. That's the first trick. Price's pen was already moving. She pointed, not touching the page, only hovering above it. This line here looks like the beginning, but it isn't. It's meant to keep people busy. See this sign? She glanced up, then drew it quickly on her sheet again. That means turn back, not to another page, to another way of reading. Price looked from her paper to the record. You're saying the writer embedded directional instructions? Yes, sir, Robert snorted. Or she's inventing them as she goes. Annie didn't look at him. No, sir. If I was inventing them, I'd make them easier. Samuel's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. Go on, Annie. She nodded and returned to the page. This mark here, the bent one like a bird neck. She drew it again. Means watch. Or be careful, Grandpa said. When a symbol looks behind itself, it usually means the writer didn't trust what came next. Vivian crossed her arms. Grandpa said is not an academic source. No, ma'am, Annie answered politely, but he was right a lot. Helen turned her face away for a second, though Annie could not tell whether she was annoyed or hiding the beginning of reluctant interest. Annie continued. And this one, therefore, 3 dots in a triangle. That means there's another meaning under the first meaning. So if the words look plain, they're not plain. Price paused his writing. A secondary layer. Yes, sir. She moved to the center of the line. Then this star means a name that isn't written out. The writer knew the person. The writer wanted family to know who it was without putting the name where strangers could see. That changed the air around the table. Everyone understood a hidden name. Annie read the line again silently. This time the way her grandfather had taught her. Ignore the proud-looking words. Follow the side signs. Let the repeated marks show you which words belong together. Then she spoke. It says, watch the one who wears the family face and speaks as if the house were his. No one breathed. Robert's head came up sharply. That cannot possibly be what's written. Price bent over the page, searching, but of course he could not see what she saw yet. He could only hear it. Annie read on, a little stronger now. He was not first among us in truth, only in appetite. Vivian's face went pale. Helen's hand tightened around the arm of her chair. Robert gave a rough laugh, but there was no humor in it now. Charles, enough of this. Charles did not move. Let her finish the line. Annie followed the symbols downward. Now that she had the rhythm of the page, it came faster, exactly the way it used to happen when Joseph Brooks laid a coded fragment before her and she suddenly felt the writer's pattern unlock. This part says the writer hid the right reading at the edges because pride always reads the middle first. She looked up briefly. That's why no one got it. Price looked startled by how calmly she said it. She shifted to another cluster. This little circle with dots means skip and return. So this part belongs with the marks lower down, not the sentence beside it. You're certain? Price asked. Yes, sir. How? Because if you don't skip, the line contradicts itself. Grandpa said real codes can be tricky, but they still have to mean something when they're done. Price slowly nodded. He had the expression of a man watching procedure give way to evidence. Annie read again, now linking the symbols as she went. The first theft was not of silver, but of place. Samuel Pike shut his eyes for one brief second. Helen looked at him. You know something. Samuel opened his eyes again. I know old families don't start lying when money arrives, ma'am. They start much earlier than that. No one rebuked him. Annie turned the page carefully and found more of the same hand, though shakier here, with heavier pressure in the downstrokes and tighter symbols in the margins. This page was written later, she said. Price blinked. You can tell that? Yes, sir. The hand's more tired, and the secret marks are smaller, like the writer thought somebody might take the book away before he was done. She held the record open with one hand and used the pencil in the other to point as she explained. This one looks like a key. Not a door key exactly. More like the right truth before something opens. So when it sits beside a person sign, it means that person unlocks the next part. She moved lower, and the hidden name star is here again. So somebody important isn't being named plain. Then Annie read the next line, and this time even her small voice carried enough force to make the room feel suddenly much colder. Do not trust the smiling brother with the easy hand. He counts before he grieves. Robert stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. This is outrageous. Lila gasped softly from the back wall. Helen did not rise, but the color had gone from her face. Vivian looked as though the room itself had insulted her. Price's pen had stopped. Charles remained seated for one long second more, then stood slowly. his expression unreadable in the lamp glow and the low firelight. "Sit down, Robert," he said. Robert stared at him. "You think I'm going to sit here while a child accuses me using nonsense scratches from a dead man's notebook?" Charles's voice turned hard as iron. "I think you're going to sit down because she has done more in 3 minutes than any hired expert has done in 10 years. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this." That ended it. Not the tension, not the fear, but the argument that Annie should be ignored. Robert sat. No one spoke after Annie finished the line about the witness in the West Hall portrait. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt crowded with the thoughts no one wanted to say aloud, with old suspicions suddenly given shape, with the uncomfortable realization that the family record was no clever antique puzzle at all. It was a warning, and warnings always became more dangerous once someone young enough, poor enough, and overlooked enough had the courage to read them without flinching. Annie stood on the chair beside the walnut table, one hand resting lightly on the open page, the other still holding the pencil Samuel Pike had given her. Her heart was beating faster now, but her voice had not shaken. That surprised even her. She could feel the attention of every adult in the room pressing toward her, heavy as the rain against the windows. Charles Halbrook remained standing at the head of the table. He had not sat down since ordering Robert to take his seat. In the low glow of the library lamps, his face had changed. He no longer looked like a man humoring a child. He looked like a man standing too close to something that might alter the shape of his family. Helen was the first to move. She rose slowly from her chair, smoothing one hand over the black skirt of her dress, more to steady herself than from habit. "Charles," she said, her tone carefully controlled, "we need to stop and think before this goes any further." Robert gave a bitter laugh. At last. But Helen did not turn to him. She kept her eyes on Charles. "I'm not saying she's inventing this. I'm saying we are letting a 6-year-old pull us toward accusations with no context and no verification." "She isn't pulling us anywhere," Charles said. "She's reading what's in front of us." Vivian's composure, so polished at the start of the morning, had begun to fray at the edges. "And what if what's in front of us was never meant to be dragged out like this?" she asked. "What if our great-grandfather left things coded for a reason? Families survive by knowing what to bury." Samuel Pike, standing near the shelves with his hands folded behind his back, answered before Charles could. "Some families survive, ma'am. Others only appear to." Vivian turned toward him sharply, but she did not challenge him. Perhaps because she sensed, as Annie did, that Samuel was no longer speaking as staff. He was speaking as the oldest witness in the room. Annie lowered her eyes to the page again. She did not need the room to agree with her in order to keep reading. Her grandfather had trained that out of her before she was old enough to know what training was. Joseph Brooks had never cared whether other people found his work convenient. He cared whether it was sound. He had taught Annie that grown people often mistook confidence for truth because confidence was easier to listen to. Now, with the Halbrook family watching her as though they wished at once to silence her and depend on her, Annie felt the old steadiness of his voice return in memory. "Don't read for approval, Annie girl. Read for what holds." She turned the page. The next section of the record was more compressed, the writing tighter and more urgent than what came before. She studied it for several long seconds before speaking. No one interrupted. Even Robert seemed to understand now that interruption would only make him look afraid. "This part goes with what I just read," Annie said at last. "It's the same thought, only plainer." Price leaned in over the table. "Plainer how?" Annie searched for the best way to explain it. "The writer was hiding before," she said. "Now he's less careful. Like he didn't think he'd have another chance." That sent something cold through the room. Charles's jaw tightened. Helen folded her arms, but not in dismissal this time. More like protection. Vivian looked down at the polished table as though the wood itself had become untrustworthy. Annie read another line silently, then spoke it aloud. "It says the house was built on a wrong choice nobody wanted to undo because the wrong choice made everybody comfortable after it." Robert scoffed, but it sounded forced, conveniently vague. Annie looked up at him then. Not rudely, just directly. "No, sir. Vague would make people feel safe. This was written to make somebody feel found. No one rescued Robert from that. Price resumed his notes, though more slowly now, as if he no longer trusted speed. "Can you tell who the writer feared most?" he asked. Annie looked back at the page. "Not yet. But he feared family more than strangers. You can tell because he doesn't explain the people part. He assumes the right reader will already know where the hurt started." Charles stared at the record for a long moment. "And you think the West Hall portrait is part of that?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Annie answered in the simple way she always did when she was most sure. "Because it came after the line about the witness. If the portrait wasn't important, it wouldn't have been tied to the hidden thing." Helen slowly sat back down, though she no longer looked composed. "I have walked that hall for years." Samuel glanced toward her. "Yes, ma'am. And whatever this is, was simply hanging there? That would appear to be the point." The rain thickened outside. Wind brushed the old windowpanes with a low moan. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked in the long quiet of a house listening to its own past. Lila Brooks finally stepped a little closer to Annie's chair. She did not touch her daughter, perhaps afraid even then of appearing too forward in a room that still was not hers. But her face, pale with worry at the beginning of the morning, now held something else too. Annie saw it the way children see what adults think they hide well. Amazement mixed with fear, and beneath both, the ache of a mother realizing her child has stepped into a place she can no longer shield her from. "Baby," Lila said softly, "you don't have to keep going if you're tired." Annie shook her head. "I'm not tired, Mama." The truth was stranger than that. The more she read, the less tired she felt. The record had a shape now, not a full one yet, but enough that it no longer looked like confusion. It looked like a person trying to be believed by someone in the future. She turned another page. "This one talks about place," Annie said. "Not a place on land, a place in the family." Vivian's head lifted sharply. "Read it." Annie obeyed. "It says someone was moved out of their proper place and everyone after that learned to live in the lie because it was easier than giving the place back." Helen closed her eyes for a brief second. Price stopped writing again. Robert swore under his breath. Charles's voice, when it came, was lower than before. "Does it say who?" "No, sir, not here." "Does it say when?" "Long ago. Before your time. Before his too." Annie looked toward the old portraits without fully meaning to. "It sounds like the kind of thing people decided to call finished because they didn't want to be the one who fixed it." That sentence landed with a force beyond her years, and everyone in the room knew it. Samuel was the one who broke the stillness. "Mr. Halbrook," he said, "whatever this began as, it is no longer speculation. The child has established a pattern. The portrait in the West Hall should be examined." Vivian reacted immediately. "Absolutely not. Not until Edwin reviews everything properly." Price looked at her with unusual frankness. "Missus, Mercer, if there is physical corroboration attached to the written instruction, delay may be the least proper choice available to us." Robert stood again. Slower this time. "So that's it? We chase a child's reading into the hallway and tear apart family portraits because everyone's suddenly in the mood for theater?" "No," Charles said. That single word quieted the room more effectively than any raised voice could have done. He stepped away from the head of the table and came around to Annie's side. He did not tower over her the way some adults did when speaking to children. Instead, he stopped at a respectful distance and looked first at the open record, then at the little girl holding steady before it. "Annie," he said, "if we go into that hallway, are you telling me you believe the record will make more sense there?" "Yes, sir." "And you are certain?" She thought of her grandfather's hands, broad and careful, turning old pages as though history deserved gentleness even when people did not. She thought of her mother standing behind her in borrowed stillness. She thought of all the adults in the room who had begun the morning convinced they knew exactly who mattered. Then she nodded. "Yes, sir, I am." Charles drew a slow breath, then looked up at the others. "We're going to the West Hall." Vivian half rose from her chair in disbelief. Helen did not stop him this time. Robert looked furious, but there was something else in it now, something more brittle than anger. Price gathered his papers. Samuel moved toward the door before being asked, already understanding what service meant when a family's old silence finally began to split. Lila reached Annie at last and laid one gentle hand against her back. The touch steadied her more than anything else in the room. Charles held the library door open himself. For the first time that day, nobody walked out according to rank. Not Charles first. Not the lawyer. Not the wife or the sister or the brother. They all followed the child. The West Hall of Halbrook House had always been a place people passed through without lingering. It was too formal for comfort, and too familiar to invite curiosity. The floorboards were dark oak, polished to a muted glow by generations of careful upkeep. Tall windows faced the rain-soaked lawns, and between them hung portraits of the Halbrook dead in frames heavy enough to outlast fashion, scandal, and perhaps even memory. On ordinary days, the hall served its purpose silently. It connected the library to the formal dining room, the dining room to the front staircase, the staircase to the rest of the house. A corridor. Nothing more. But that morning it felt like a witness box. Charles led the group into the hall and stopped halfway down, his eyes moving over the painted faces as if he were seeing them for the first time. Price came behind him carrying the family record and his notes. Helen and Vivian followed with very different kinds of reluctance. Helen's held tight beneath discipline. Vivian's sharpened into open resentment. Robert came last among the family, not because he had yielded anything, but because a man looks different once a room has begun to wonder what he fears. Samuel Pike stepped to one side, giving Annie a clear view. Lila stayed close behind her daughter now, no longer at the far wall where staff were expected to disappear. Annie could feel her mother's hand hovering at the middle of her back, ready to steady her if she stumbled, ready to claim her if the room turned hard again. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon wax, damp air from the old windows, and the dry woven scent of antique canvas. Annie looked up at the portraits one by one. A stern-looking man with side whiskers and an iron jaw. A woman in pale silk seated beside a marble column. A military coat in one frame, a judge's robe in another. Eyes that seemed to follow, but only because they had once expected the world to do as it was told. "Which portrait?" Charles asked. His tone was measured, but Annie heard the strain beneath it. He wanted certainty from a child because the adults had failed him. That was a dangerous thing to want from anyone, especially someone 6 years old. Annie did not answer right away. She looked down at the open record in Price's hands, then back up at the row of portraits. Her grandfather had always warned her that once people started feeling frightened, they rushed. And the moment people rushed, they stopped seeing. So she made herself slow. The line she had read in the library came back clearly. Ask the witness kept in the West Hall portrait. For paint remembers where paper was denied. Not the portraits. Singular. The witness. She walked a few careful steps forward, her shoes making almost no sound against the runner. The adults watched with that strange combination of doubt and need she had begun to recognize in them. Annie studied the frames, not the faces at first. That was what her grandfather would have done. People looked at paintings. He looked at nails, corners, backing boards, dust lines, repairs. The first frame bore a skin of gray dust in the top grooves and none in the lower carved leaves. Recently wiped, perhaps, but not unusual in a large house. The second had a tiny crack in the gilding, old and dark. The third sat a fraction crooked, though only enough for someone very patient to notice. Annie stopped before a portrait of a younger woman in cream satin, her hand resting on the back of a red velvet chair. She was beautiful in the way old portraits liked women to be. Beautiful, quiet, contained, impossible to question. "No," Annie murmured. Vivian folded her arms tighter. "Well, this is going splendidly." "Vivian," Charles said, without looking at her. Annie moved on. Then she reached the portrait at the far bend of the hall and stopped completely. It was larger than the others. A three-quarter painting of a man in his 30s with dark hair, one hand inside his coat and the other resting on a rolled set of documents. Not military, not judicial. Merchant, Annie guessed, or financier, someone whose power had begun with paper before it became brick and land and generations of polished wood. The brass plate at the bottom read Elias Halbrook, 1881. Annie's eyes went first to the man's painted face and then past it, almost at once, to the frame itself. "There," she yelled. No one moved. Robert gave a short, incredulous laugh. "On what basis?" Annie pointed to the lower right edge of the frame. "That corner's been opened before." Price stepped closer. "Opened? The dust doesn't match," Annie said. and the little nail at the side is newer. Samuel leaned in, and after a moment, nodded slowly. She's right. Robert let out an exasperated sound. Of course she is. Helen came nearer too, not quite touching the frame. Why this one? Annie looked back at the record. Because the writing felt proud and afraid at the same time. This man looks like that. Vivian stared at her. That is not evidence. No, ma'am, Annie replied. The nail is evidence. For the first time, Charles almost smiled. It did not soften him much, but it changed the room by a degree. Samuel, he said. Can it be removed safely? Yes, sir. Then do it. Vivian stepped forward. Charles, absolutely not. That portrait has hung here for decades. And if it has been hiding something for decades, Helen said quietly, then that matters more than the hook it hangs on. Vivian turned toward her in shock, as if betrayal had changed seats. Robert said nothing at all now. Annie noticed that, in the library, he had argued loudly. Here, with the portrait in front of them, his silence had become watchful. Samuel disappeared down the hall and returned with a small step stool and a pair of cotton gloves. He worked with grave care, the kind born of years spent tending other people's treasures while keeping his own thoughts to himself. Price held the record against his chest. Charles stood close enough to intervene if the frame slipped. Lila drew Annie back half a step, protective without interrupting. Stand behind me, baby, she whispered. I can still see, Mama. I know. Samuel climbed the stool and began with the lower latch. There was no latch, exactly. Only the appearance of one another detail Annie thought her grandfather would have appreciated. When the frame shifted free, it did so with a dry little sound, as if old wood were exhaling. Everyone in the hall seemed to breathe at once. Behind the portrait was not plaster. It was a recessed panel, narrow and shallow, fitted flush into the wall. Price stared. Good Lord. Samuel carefully set the portrait down against the hall wall. Charles reached toward the recess but stopped before touching it. Annie stepped closer again, despite her mother's tension. A hiding place. Robert found his voice. Anyone could have put that there. Yes, Annie said. But not anyone would know to send us to it. That ended his objection as neatly as if she had shut a door in his face. Inside the recess lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth gone yellow at the folds. There was also a slim envelope tied with a faded ribbon and a folded paper placed above both, as though meant to be found first. Price looked to Charles. Sir? Charles did not take his eyes off the cavity in the wall. You'll open it. Helen's face had gone still in the way people's faces do when they realize family stories are about to become family evidence. Vivian looked suddenly older than she had in the library. Samuel climbed down from the stool with care, and when his feet reached the floor, he stood straighter. Not from relief, but from the gravity of what had been confirmed. Lila's hand found Annie's shoulder. You did this, she whispered, almost unable to believe the words. Annie shook her head slightly. No, Mama. He did. Who? Annie glanced from the hidden packet to the portrait of Elias Halbrook leaning against the wall, the one who wanted somebody to know. Price slipped one finger under the folded paper and lifted it from the recess. The sheet was brittle, but intact. At the top, in dark old ink, was a line written larger than the rest, meant to catch the eye before any hand could tremble too much to hold it. Price read it once silently, then he looked up, and for the first time that day, even the lawyer's composure seemed shaken. What does it say? Charles asked. Price swallowed. It says, he answered, to the one in this family still willing to bear the truth. No one spoke. The rain at the windows had become a steady silver wall. The portraits along the hall looked on in their oiled silence. At Annie's side, her mother's fingers trembled once, and then steadied. Charles held out his hand. Read the rest, he said. Price unfolded the brittle sheet with the care of a man who understood that paper could survive a century and still be ruined by one careless thumb. No one in the West Hall seemed to breathe. Charles stood nearest, one hand braced lightly against the wall beside the recess. Helen remained a few feet behind him, her face pale but composed in the disciplined way of someone raised to conceal alarm beneath good posture. Vivian had not moved since the hidden compartment had opened. Robert looked less angry now than cornered, which Annie noticed immediately. Samuel Pike stood with the old portrait at his side, as solemn as if he were attending a second funeral. Lila's hand still rested on Annie's shoulder, warm and trembling. Price lowered his eyes to the page. "It appears to be written by Elias Halbrook," he said quietly. "The hand is consistent with the signatures in the earlier ledgers." Charles gave a brief nod. "Read it," Price began. "To the one in this family still willing to bear the truth. Know first that I write not to wound the house, but to keep it from becoming so proud of its walls that it forgets the bones beneath them." The sentence moved through the hall like a draft from another century. Vivian shut her eyes for a moment. Helen looked at the old portrait leaning against the wall, as though the painted face had become less decorative and more accusatory. Price continued, "What was taken in my day was not merely money, though money followed. It was place. It was name. It was the right ordering of kin. A child was denied standing for the comfort of those already seated, and from that wrong, all later silence grew." Robert gave a harsh exhale. "This is impossible." No one answered him, because the word impossible had already lost its authority in that house. Annie looked from one adult face to another. She did not understand every implication of inheritance law, bloodline, or formal recognition, but she understood the shape of what had just been read. Someone had been pushed out, not by accident, not by poverty alone, pushed out because making room for them would have cost the family something it had not wanted to pay. Her grandfather had once told her that rich families lied most elegantly when they called injustice arrangement. Price read on. The boy in question bore Halbrook blood as surely as any child christened before the church. Yet he was made to live at the edge of the house, spoken of in lowered voices, handled as a difficulty rather than acknowledged as a son. Helen drew in a breath, slight but audible. Vivian's hand found the pearl strand at her throat and held it there, as if the touch could steady her. Samuel lowered his eyes. Charles said nothing. Annie noticed that too. He had the stillness of a man listening for the part that would tell him whether the shame belonged only to the dead or had somehow continued into his own time. Price paused over the next line, then read more slowly. "The mother was not of our rank, and so the child paid the price for the father's cowardice. Let no descendant of mine pretend that class is cleaner than sin. It is merely better dressed." Even in a hall filled with portraits of old power, the sentence landed like a slap. Samuel Pike let out the smallest sound. Not quite approval, not quite grief. It sounded more like recognition. Robert looked at Charles. "You cannot mean to let this stand as evidence of anything. A letter hidden behind a painting? Written by a man who's been dead over 100 years? Price answered before Charles could. "Hidden documents accompanied by coded reference in a known family record qualify as evidence of intent, at the very least." Robert turned on him. "Intent is not law." "No," Price said. "But it has a way of dragging law after it." Annie liked Mr. Price more for that sentence, though she would not have known how to explain why. Charles extended his hand. "What else is in the compartment?" Samuel carefully passed him the oilcloth packet, but Charles did not open it himself. Instead, he gave it back to Price, perhaps because lawyers were steadier with old proof than family ever was. Price set the letter atop the broad frame of the removed portrait and began to untie the oilcloth bundle. The knots were stiff with age. When the fabric finally loosened, 3 items emerged. A narrow leather notebook, a sealed envelope bearing no name, and a folded parchment map of some kind, yellowed and cracked at the creases. Robert laughed again, but it sounded thinner now. "Wonderful. More relics. They were hidden with the letter," Helen said. "That makes them more than relics." Vivian turned to Charles with sudden urgency. "We do not need to keep doing this in the hallway. If we must continue, then fine. Back in the library, privately, before the whole household starts whispering." At that, Lila instinctively stepped back, as if the phrase whole household had reminded her where she was supposed to disappear again. Charles noticed. Annie saw him notice. "No one leaves," he said. "Not yet." The sentence did not raise his voice, but it redrew the boundaries of the moment. Lila stopped retreating. Samuel remained where he was. Helen looked toward Charles with the first sign of open surprise she had shown all morning. Price opened the small leather notebook. The pages inside were filled with dates, names, short account lines, and remarks in the same old hand as the letter, though less carefully formed. This was not confession. This was tracking, the sort of book a practical man kept when conscience and self-protection required an exact memory. Price flipped to the first legible page and frowned. There are repeated references to a household stipend, he said. Not listed among primary staff accounts. Samuel spoke quietly. Kept off the main books, then? Price nodded once. It would appear so. Name? Charles asked. Price ran a finger down the page. Mara Bell. Something changed in Vivian's face, quick and involuntary. Annie caught it because children often saw the first honest expression before adults had time to bury it. Helen caught it too. You know that name. Vivian straightened at once. I know many names from this house. That isn't what I asked. I said I know it. And? Charles asked. Vivian pressed her lips together. When she spoke, she sounded younger and more brittle than before. My grandmother used it once, many years ago. Not as staff, more like a family inconvenience from before anyone wished to remember such things. Samuel turned his head toward her. That is one way of putting it, ma'am. Vivian's eyes flashed. Do not lecture me. Samuel, I would never presume to, ma'am. But the gentle answer only made her flush more deeply. Annie looked down at the old notebook. The boy was hers. No one had asked her, but she knew it. Price checked the page again. There are references to the child beside the stipend, yes, and later to tuition paid under another surname. Charles's stare sharpened. Another surname? Yes. Which one? Price turned the page. Bell. The child was not entered under Halbrook. The rain hammered harder against the windows. Somewhere downstairs, the front door opened and closed, perhaps with a courier or a late-arriving floral delivery still left over from the funeral. Life outside the West Hall kept moving, unaware that an entire family history had begun to crack. Helen folded her arms more tightly. So the hidden child was educated, provided for, and erased. It would seem so, Price said. Robert seized on that. Then what exactly are we mourning here? Old hypocrisy? Fine. Welcome to every respectable family in America. Charles turned to him slowly. If that's all you hear in this, then you are proving the letter right. That shut him up. Annie stepped a little closer to the notebook. There's more. Price looked down. You can see that from there? She pointed. Not the words. The way it stops. It doesn't end finished. Price flipped to the final written pages. Annie was right. The entries grew sparse, then urgent, then ended with 3 lines written more darkly than the rest. He read the first in silence. Then aloud, if they deny him still, the proof shall remain where the West Hall watches and where the old surveyor's marks keep faith better than descendants do. Charles frowned. Surveyor's marks? Price looked up. Possibly the map. He unfolded the yellowed parchment with Samuel's help. It was a property plan of the original Halbrook grounds, drawn before later additions reshaped the estate. Annie could not read all of it from where she stood, but she saw enough to understand that the house had once been smaller, the outbuildings closer, the orchard stretching farther west than it did now. Near the lower margin, one section had been marked in darker ink. Samuel leaned in. That was the old carriage house, sir. Torn down before your father renovated the grounds. Price traced the notation beside it. And beneath that, a foundation vault. Charles looked from the map to the notebook, then back to Annie. She felt her mother's hand tighten again, not from shame this time, from the dread of realizing that one truth was leading to another, and another, and another, and there might not be any graceful way to stop once the first had been spoken aloud. Charles drew a slow breath. Back to the library, he said. All of it. The letter, the notebook, the map. Vivian protested immediately. Charles! No. He turned to Annie then, and his face, for the first time all morning, held neither indulgence nor surprise. It held respect shadowed by something heavier. You were right, he said. Annie did not smile. The moment was too serious for that. She only nodded once, and as Samuel lifted the portrait and Price gathered the hidden papers, the West Hall no longer felt like a passage between rooms. It felt like the place where silence had finally lost. By the time they returned to the library, the room no longer belonged to mourning. It belonged to evidence. The fire had burned lower, leaving the air cooler than before. One of the servants had quietly come in while the family was in the West Hall and refreshed the coffee tray. But the silver pot now sat untouched, breathing a thin ribbon of steam beside cups no one seemed interested in lifting. The old leather record lay open where Price had left it. Beside it he placed the hidden letter, the notebook, and the yellowed property map with a care that made the walnut table look less like furniture and more like a courtroom bench. No one took their original seats in quite the same way. Charles remained standing at first, one hand on the back of his chair, as if he no longer trusted the comfort of sitting. Helen chose her place more slowly now, and kept the hidden letter within view. Vivian sat rigid and quiet, which on a woman like her spoke louder than outrage. Robert lowered himself into his chair with visible reluctance, as though every object on the table had become a personal accusation. Samuel Pike stood near the library doors, but not in the old posture of household staff awaiting orders. He stood like a man who understood that age sometimes turns service into witness, whether anyone wishes it or not. Lila Brooks remained close to Annie. That, too, had changed. At the start of the morning, Lila had kept herself and her daughter against the wall, careful not to take up more room than necessity required. Now she stood just behind Annie's chair, one hand lightly resting at the center of the girl's back. It was no grand gesture, no declaration, only a mother's quiet claim. But in a room governed for generations by blood, rank, and polished manners, it mattered. Price adjusted the papers in front of him and looked to Charles. "How would you like to proceed, sir?" Charles did not answer immediately. His eyes moved from the map to the notebook, and then to the child at the side of the table. "With order," he said at last. "And with everything on record." Robert gave a short, humorless laugh. "Now we're formal." "We should have been formal from the moment the record began to answer back," Helen said. Robert turned toward her. "You seem very comfortable with this." "No," Helen replied. "I'm simply less comfortable with denial." That left him with nothing graceful to say. Price opened the leather notebook to the marked pages again. "The references to Mara Bell are consistent," he said. "There are repeated stipend entries over a 14-year period, then educational payments under the same surname. No mention of the boy's given name in the lines I've reviewed so far. Only the child, then later the boy, then eventually initials." "Which initials?" Charles asked. Price turned 2 pages. J, B. Annie looked up at once. The letters landed inside her with the faint jolt of something familiar. Not because she understood the family connection yet, but because initials had always mattered in her grandfather's papers. Joseph Brooks had labeled everything by initials first, names second, as though identity began in shorthand and had to be earned back in full. Samuel Pike noticed Annie's expression. "You see something, miss?" Annie looked from the notebook to the property map. "Not see, just, it feels like the writer stopped hiding a little." Price considered that. "Meaning, when people are afraid, they hide more. When they get tired, they hide less." Annie pointed softly toward the notebook. "At the beginning he says child, then boy, then initials. That means the truth got heavier to keep carrying." No one dismissed her now. Price nodded once, almost to himself. "That is a sensible reading of the progression." Vivian shifted in her seat. "Even if this hidden child existed, and even if there was some shameful arrangement generations ago, what exactly are we doing? Digging up old disgrace to satisfy a dead man's taste for melodrama?" Charles turned to her. "If that's what you believe this is, then you have not been listening." Vivian lifted her chin. "I've been listening perfectly well. I'm asking what practical purpose any of it serves." "The practical purpose," Price said, "is that Charles attached a portion of the estate to the correct interpretation of the record. If the hidden family line or its treatment affects title, trust language, or beneficiary intent, then it serves a great many purposes." Robert let out a breath through his nose. "There it is. Money again." "No," Helen said quietly. "Consequence." The distinction settled over the room with uncomfortable clarity. Annie looked down at the map as Price smoothed it flatter. The old survey lines wandered through the original estate with a kind of severe confidence she recognized from old technical drawings her grandfather used to bring home. The house itself had once been smaller, more exposed. The carriage house stood where there was now only lawn, and a row of clipped hedges. Near the west boundary, a square shape had been marked beneath the old outbuilding, and beside it a notation too faded for Annie to make out from where she stood. "May I come closer?" she asked. Charles answered at once. Yes. Lila's hand left her back only long enough for Annie to step around the chair. She moved to the table and leaned carefully beside Price, not touching the map, only looking. "It's the same hand as the note?" Charles asked Price. "Yes, or near enough to indicate the same source." He tapped the darkened notation by the square mark. "This appears to reference a vault, or lower storage chamber." Samuel came nearer. "The carriage house had a stone base, sir. My father remembered it before it came down. He said there was a cool room beneath it used in summer for storage before the ice house was added." Charles looked up. "Your father told you that?" "Yes, sir. He worked for your grandfather as a groundsman when I was a boy." That seemed to matter to Charles. The Halbrooks had long histories, but histories tended to be easier when spoken in the family's own voice. Now the truth was assembling itself from Butler's fathers, hidden stipends, and a child's eye for patterns. That was not how old houses liked to be explained. Annie narrowed her eyes at the notation on the map. "That word there, it's not just vault." Price glanced down. "You can read it?" "Not all of it. But the last part says ledger." His head came up. "Ledger?" Annie nodded. "I think so." Robert leaned forward in frustration. "You think so. You think. You feel. You believe. We are rebuilding family history on a 6-year-old's instincts." Before anyone else could speak, Lila did. "My daughter has been right about every step so far." The library went completely still. Lila seemed surprised by her own voice, as if the sentence had emerged before fear could stop it. She stood straighter after it, though Annie could see her pulse flickering at her throat. Robert stared at her. "This is not your place." "No," Lila said, and the softness in her tone made it stronger, not weaker. "But Annie's been put in it all the same." Helen looked at Lila for a long moment, then lowered her eyes. Not in surrender, Annie thought, but in recognition. There were women who had never been servants, and still knew what it meant to speak in rooms where men assumed the air belonged to them. Samuel cleared his throat gently, giving the room a way to move on with its dignity partly intact. "If there is a ledger," he said, "then Elias meant for the truth to be provable, not merely confessed." Price nodded. "And if the map and notebook correspond, the next step is obvious." "Carriage House Foundation," Charles said. The words changed the atmosphere at once. A letter could be argued with. A hidden notebook could be minimized, but a physical location on the estate, tied to survey marks and old household memory, pointed toward something harder to dismiss. Vivian rose from her chair. "Absolutely not today." Charles looked at her. "Why?" "Because this has gone far enough for one morning. Because the house is full of people. Because the weather is miserable. Because my brother was buried 2 days ago. And because decent families do not go digging through ruined foundations on the word of old letters and buried shame." "Perhaps decent families should have done it sooner," Helen said. Vivian stared at her, almost wounded. Charles finally sat. Not from weariness, but from decision. Once seated, he seemed more dangerous than when he stood. More fixed. "We are not doing this with half measures anymore," he said. "Edwin, everything stays documented. Samuel, have someone check the old grounds plans from storage and see whether the foundation lines still correspond with the current west lawn." Quietly, no gossip, he turned to Vivian. "And yes, today," Robert pushed back from the table. "You cannot seriously mean to excavate part of the property over this." "Not excavate," Charles said. "Inspect. That is a lawyer's word for the same humiliation." "No," Price said, closing the notebook. "Humiliation is what families feel when secrets outlive courtesy." Even Samuel glanced at him for that one. Charles looked at Annie then, not as one looks at a child to be comforted or shooed away, but as one looks at the person who has made denial impossible. "Annie," he said, "before we go any further, I want to know one thing. If there is a ledger under the old carriage house, why do you think the record sent us first to the portrait?" Annie considered the question carefully. Her grandfather had always said that the best answer was usually the one that felt least proud. Because people trust walls before they trust ground, she said, and because the portrait proved the writer was telling the truth before asking anybody to go looking deeper. Price's expression shifted into something close to admiration. Helen's eyes softened despite herself. Even Vivian did not immediately object. Charles gave a slow nod. Exactly. Outside, the rain began to ease, though the gray light through the library windows remained cold and thin. Somewhere downstairs, the clock in the front hall struck noon. Morning had become afternoon without anyone noticing. Samuel moved toward the door, already preparing to carry out the quiet instructions. Price gathered the letter, notebook, and map into a tidy stack, the way men do when facts have become too consequential to leave untended. Lila bent and smoothed Annie's cardigan at the shoulder, a tiny gesture of care that said more than any praise might have. And as the room rearranged itself around the next step, Annie looked once more at the old family record lying open on the walnut table. It no longer seemed secretive now, only patient, as if it had waited all these years not for the cleverest person in the house, but for the one person no one had thought important enough to deceive. Samuel Pike returned 20 minutes later with mud on the hem of his trousers and an old ring of iron keys resting in his palm like something retrieved from a forgotten part of the century. By then, the library had settled into a tense, unnatural stillness. No one had touched the refreshed coffee. The luncheon that should have been laid in the dining room remained delayed, its covered dishes cooling somewhere below stairs while Halbrook House held its breath around a child. A dead man's puzzle, and the possibility that the estate itself had been standing over the truth for generations. Charles had not left the room. Neither had Price. Helen had moved to the window and stood there for several minutes without really looking out. One arm folded across her waist, the fingertips of the other hand resting lightly against her mouth. Vivian had returned to silence, though hers was no longer composed. It had the brittle look of someone whose idea of family had begun to split along old seams. Robert paced once, then twice, then finally gave up and stood at the mantel, staring into the low fire as if anger might reveal itself more clearly in coals than in people. Annie sat in the high-backed chair Samuel had placed near the walnut table, her legs too short to reach the floor, her hands folded in her lap when she was not tracing the edge of her own borrowed sheet of paper. Lila stood beside her. Every so often, almost without realizing it, she smoothed Annie's sleeve or adjusted the collar of her blue cardigan. The motions were small, almost invisible, but they carried all the tenderness she was too cautious to display openly in a room like that. When Samuel entered, all heads turned. "Well?" Charles asked. Samuel crossed to the table and set down the keys first. The west lawn still shows signs of settling where the old carriage house foundation once stood. "Sir, the ground dips slightly along the stone line after heavy rain. You don't notice it unless you know where to look." He placed a second item beside the keys, a folded estate maintenance sketch, much newer than the survey map but clearly copied from older measurements. And the old service access was never completely filled. It was bricked over, not removed. Price picked up the sketch. "Below-grade access?" "Yes, sir. A narrow stair originally used for cool storage and later for records too fragile for the main house in summer humidity. My father mentioned it once, though I'd never seen it myself." Robert let out a low sound of disbelief. "And no one thought to mention this charming little vault before now?" Samuel looked at him calmly. "No one thought to ask before now." That struck with just enough force to make Robert look away first. Price unfolded the sketch next to the old survey map and aligned the corners with practiced care. "The locations correspond," he said. "Not perfectly, later landscaping altered the path, but the structure is the same." He glanced up at Charles. "If the ledger exists, there is now a reasonable basis to believe it may still be on the property." Vivian's hand closed around the back of her chair. "Reasonable basis for whom? Lawyers, accountants, or treasure hunters?" "None of the above," Helen said, still at the window. "For descendants who have finally run out of excuses." Vivian turned sharply. "Do you intend to keep taking his side in this?" Helen faced her at last. "I'm not taking a side. I'm recognizing a fact. Those are different things." Charles said nothing, but Annie noticed the way his shoulders eased by one small degree, not because Helen agreed with him exactly, but because she had stopped resisting the truth simply because it was inconvenient. Price closed the maintenance sketch and laid it atop the map. "If we are going to inspect the site, We should do it before dusk. The ground will only worsen if the rain starts again. Lila shifted slightly behind Annie. The movement was small, but Annie felt it. Her mother was tired. Not weak, never weak, but stretched in the quiet, painful way adults became when the day kept demanding more of them than they had prepared to give. Annie turned in her chair and looked up at her. "Mama?" Lila bent slightly. "Yes, baby. Are we going outside too?" Lila's eyes flicked toward Charles, then back to Annie. There was worry there, and something else too. A reluctant understanding that this morning had moved past the point where she could keep Annie tucked behind her like a shadow. Before she could answer, Charles did. "Yes," he said, "you are." Every adult in the room seemed to register that sentence differently. Vivian with fresh dismay, Robert with irritation, Helen with a new and sharper kind of attention, Price with approval masked as procedural neutrality, Samuel with the grave calm of a man who had already accepted it. Lila hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Then she'll need her coat." "I'll fetch it," Samuel said. "No," Charles replied. "I'll wait." That, too, changed the room. In houses like Halbrook, men of Charles's position did not usually wait for servants' children to fetch coats. They certainly did not stand in the library while their household reorganized itself around one. But he stayed where he was, one hand resting on the table near the old record, as if he had begun to understand that dignity was not something bestowed downward. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to hurry past another person's humanity. Lila left with Annie for only a minute or two and returned with Annie bundled in her navy wool coat, her curls tucked under the hood's soft lining, her small hands buttoned into knit gloves, one finger at a time. Lila had put on her own coat as well, though Annie could tell by the careful way she buttoned it that it was one she wore only to church and funerals and other occasions that required her to look as composed as she felt unsettled. By then, Samuel had produced a lantern, 2 flashlights, and a canvas ground cloth from the service closet. Price collected the map, the letter, and the notebook into his leather case. Robert objected again, but his objections had lost their shape. They sounded less like principle now and more like a man trying to hold a door shut after the lock had already broken. "This is madness," he said as they moved toward the front hall. A wet lawn, a bricked-over hole, and a bedtime story turned into probate law. "No," Charles said without slowing. "It became probate law when I attached the inheritance to truth. What it has become now is accountability." Robert opened his mouth, then closed it again. Annie walked between her mother and Samuel as they crossed the front hall and passed beneath the great staircase. The grandfather clock struck once noon. Its sound rolled through the house like a reminder that ordinary time was still passing, even if no one inside Halbrook House seemed to be living by it anymore. The servants they passed kept their eyes lowered, but Annie saw curiosity in the smallest movements, the pause of a maid carrying folded table linens, the stillness of the kitchen porter by the side door, the cook visible only briefly through the swing door, wiping her hands on an apron while trying not to seem as if she were listening. Families with money often believed their secrets stayed upstairs. Annie's grandfather had once laughed at that notion. "Houses hear everything," he had said, "and houses talk through the people who keep them running." The rain had eased to a mist by the time they stepped onto the back terrace. The lawn stretched gray-green beneath the heavy sky, gleaming with damp, beyond the clipped hedges and gravel path. The west side of the property sloped gently toward a stand of old maples, and the place where the carriage house had once stood. Samuel led them there. At first, Annie saw nothing but grass and weather-dark earth. Then, as they came nearer, she noticed it. A long, shallow depression beneath the lawn. Not enough to look like damage, only enough to make the ground seem tired. A half-buried line of stone showed through near the edge of the hedges, and farther out, close to where one of the maples bent eastward, a rectangle of brick sat just beneath the soil, moss-green and nearly invisible. Samuel raised the lantern, though it was still daylight. "There, sir." Charles stepped forward with Price at his side. Helen came too, her shoes sinking slightly in the wet ground. Vivian remained on the gravel path, as though too much proximity might stain her. Robert lingered behind everyone else, hands in his coat pockets, face set. Annie stared at the rectangle. That was where the story had gone next, not into memory, into earth. Price knelt carefully and brushed away the wet leaves gathered at the edge of the brickwork. "This is no casual patch," he said. It was sealed, deliberately. Charles took one of the flashlights from Samuel. "Can it be opened?" Samuel looked at the iron key ring in his hand. Then, at the dark slit where brick met stone. "If the old mechanism still holds, sir." "Perhaps." Lila's gloved hand found Annie's shoulder again. The lawn smelled of wet soil, leaves, and the faint mineral scent that rises when old ground is disturbed. Annie felt the cold through the soles of her shoes and the strange, quiet thrill of standing at the edge of something her grandfather would have understood at once. Not treasure, never that. Proof. Samuel crouched at the brick panel and began clearing the seam. Price held the flashlight low. Charles stood over them both, silent and intent. Helen came off the path at last. Vivian did not. Robert took one step forward, then stopped, and Annie, looking at the dark line appearing beneath Samuel's careful hands, knew with the deep certainty children sometimes have before adults are ready to admit it, that whatever the Halbrooks had buried here was not meant to stay buried forever. It had only been waiting for the right person to notice where the ground was still trying to remember. Samuel worked the seam with the patience of an old man and the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime around other people's property without ever forgetting that objects, like people, tended to resist rough handling when they had been forced into silence too long. The rest of them stood in the wet gray afternoon and watched. Price held the flashlight low while Charles angled the second beam toward the iron plate half hidden beneath moss and soil. The brick panel was smaller than Annie had expected now that she stood close to it. Not the entrance to some grand chamber. Only a narrow service hatch set into the old foundation line. That made it stranger somehow. More believable. Her grandfather had always said the truth preferred modest hiding places. People looked hardest at what seemed dramatic and missed what had only been meant to survive. "There's a lock housing here," Samuel said. Price crouched lower. "Can you clear it?" "I can try, sir." Robert made a sound of impatience behind them. "All this for an old storage crawl space." "No," Helen said from a few feet away. "All this because every time we think it can't get more real, it does." Vivian remained on the gravel, arms folded against the damp air. She had not complained again, but Annie could tell she had not accepted any of it. There were people who resisted the truth because they feared being punished by it, and there were people who resisted because truth altered the story they preferred to tell about themselves. Vivian seemed to belong to the second kind. Lila kept one gloved hand on Annie's shoulder. Annie leaned into it without thinking. Samuel inserted the smallest of the iron keys into the half-cleared lock and turned gently. Nothing. He tried another, then a third. The fourth caught just enough to make a dry metallic sound deep inside the mechanism. Everyone heard it. Charles looked up sharply. Again. Samuel steadied the key and turned it more firmly this time. Something released behind the brick panel with a dull internal clunk, followed by a faint rush of stale air escaping through the seam. Price exhaled. That's it. Annie smelled it then too. Cold earth, old mortar, damp paper, and the closed-up scent of a place that had not been opened in decades. It was not a bad smell. It was the smell of time sealed underground. Samuel set down the lantern and gripped the iron ring fixed at the center of the panel. It's heavier than it looks. Charles stepped forward. I'll help. Together they lifted. The panel rose only a few inches at first, held by age and damp and the stubbornness of old construction. Then it shifted free with a sucking grind of grit and brick, revealing a dark opening and a short run of stone steps disappearing below the lawn. No one spoke. The lantern light showed walls lined in rough stone. The air below looked different from the air above, denser somehow, as if the small chamber had kept not only objects but atmosphere. Price broke the silence first. Extraordinary. Robert came closer despite himself. You can't seriously expect us to go down there. Charles looked into the opening, then at Samuel. How stable. Samuel raised the lantern and peered down. The stonework seems sound, sir. Built to hold weight. Better built than some parts of the house, if I'm honest. That almost would have been amusing on another day. Helen stepped nearer, her shoes darkening in the wet grass. If there's paper down there, the damp may already be destroying it. Price nodded. Then delay serves no one. Vivian remained where she was. Charles, think. We have no idea what's in that space. Mold, collapse, Vermin, legal complications, Robert muttered. At last, something honest. Charles ignored him. His gaze had shifted to Annie. She knew that look now. He was not asking her permission. He was asking whether the path still matched the pattern. Annie looked down into the narrow opening. Her grandfather would have loved this, she thought with a sudden ache, not because of the family money or the drama or the hidden shame. He would have loved the plainness of it, the careful logic. Portrait first, proof second, surface, then ground. Yes, she said quietly. This is right. Lila's hand tightened. Baby, Annie looked up at her mother. I'm not going down, Mama. That was enough to ease Lila's face by a degree, though only by one. Charles straightened. Samuel and I will inspect first. Edwin, you come behind us. Helen, I'm coming, Helen said. Vivian stared at her. You cannot be serious. Helen looked back over her shoulder. I am tired of men deciding what women can and cannot face in this family. For the first time since Annie had met her, Helen sounded less like a wife guarding decorum and more like a person with her own private debt to the truth. Charles nodded once. Fine, but no one crowds the steps. Robert shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. I'll stay above and call someone when the foundation gives way. Samuel did not bother disguising his disapproval. That would save time, sir. You'd already be in position to explain why you refused to help. Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Samuel took the lantern, Charles took the flashlight, and Price crouched to protect the papers in his case from the wet ground. Helen removed one glove and passed it to Price without a word, so he could better grip the stone edge as he descended. Annie noticed that too. People were changing in front of her, not into better versions of themselves perhaps, but into truer ones. The steps were narrow enough that only one person could descend at a time. Samuel went first, careful and steady. Charles followed. Then Price. Helen last. The light dropped with them, growing dimmer as the lantern sank below the line of the lawn. Annie could still see the stone mouth of the opening and the top half of Charles's shoulders for a few seconds. Then only the trembling circle of lantern glow against the walls. The voices from below came muted and strange. Mind the second step. Water damage along the left side. Wait, there's shelving. Annie held still. Beside her, Lila whispered, Lord, help us. Vivian stood further back, her face unreadable in the damp light. Robert remained where he was, but he had moved close enough now that his reluctance looked less like superiority and more like hunger. Annie saw that clearly. Whatever lived down there, he wanted to know it before anyone else named it. A minute passed. Perhaps two. Then Price's voice drifted up. There are ledgers here. Several. Robert swore softly. Vivian's composure cracked. What kind of ledgers? No answer came right away. Instead, there was the dry sound of something being lifted. Pages carefully separated. A box lid opened. Then Samuel's low voice. Sir, there's a photograph. Annie felt that sentence in her chest. Children always noticed photographs. Grown people heard them as evidence. Children heard them as people. Charles spoke from below, quieter now. Bring the lantern closer. Lila leaned toward the opening despite herself. Robert took another involuntary step forward. Even Vivian came off the gravel path at last. Then Helen's voice rose from the chamber. Oh my God. No one above moved. When Charles emerged again, the damp air of the chamber seemed to come up with him. He held the flashlight under one arm and in his gloved hand carried a flat tin box streaked with old dust. Price followed with two cloth-bound ledgers. Helen came last, pale and very still, holding a sepia photograph mounted on stiff card. Samuel remained below for another moment, passing up a wrapped bundle and one more narrow account book before climbing out himself. The rain had almost stopped completely. For a second, they all stood there in the west lawn, the open foundation at their feet, the house behind them, and the evidence of a buried life in their hands. Back inside, Charles said. No one argued. In the library, the fire was stirred up again by someone from the staff while they had been outside, and the room felt warmer than before, though not more comfortable. Price spread a ground cloth near the table so the damp items could be set down without damaging the wood. Charles placed the tin box in the center. Helen laid the photograph beside it as gently as if it had a pulse. Annie leaned forward in her chair, and this time no one told her not to. The photograph showed a young black woman seated stiffly in a plain dark dress, her hands folded in her lap, her face beautiful and unsmiling. Standing beside her was a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, slim, solemn, with one hand resting against the chair as though he had been told not to fidget. He wore a jacket too fine for ordinary use but not quite tailored to him, as if bought for appearance rather than belonging. On the back, in faded ink, was written only this: Mara and James, Summer House, 1892. Annie stared at the boy's face, not because she recognized him, because she recognized what had been done to him. Given enough, dressed enough, near enough, but not brought in. Price opened the first ledger with reverent haste. Charles stood over him. Helen remained beside the photograph, one bare hand resting on the table edge. Vivian did not sit. Robert finally did, though with the rigid body of a man bracing for a blow he could no longer dodge. Annie looked at the names again. Mara, James. The notebook upstairs had held initials. B. Her pulse quickened. "It's him," she said softly. Every face turned toward her. "The boy," Annie said. "James Bell." The initials. Price looked down at the ledger, then at the photograph, then back to Annie. "Yes," he said. "I believe it is." He swallowed once and opened to the first written page. "And now," he added, his voice changed by the weight of what lay before him, "we may finally learn what the family did after hiding him." The library went silent again, not with doubt this time, with dread. Price turned the first ledger page with the same care he had given the hidden letter, but the effect was entirely different. Letters could be argued with. Letters belonged to feeling, confession, regret. Ledgers belonged to repetition, to systems, to choices made more than once. And repetition, Annie's grandfather had told her, was where people stopped pretending their mistakes were accidents. The library held still around the table. Outside, the rain had finally thinned to a pale wash against the windows, and the gray afternoon light now mixed with the firelight in a way that made everyone's face look both older and more exposed. The photograph of Mara Bell and her son lay near the center of the walnut table, just beyond the ledger Price had opened. Annie could not stop looking at the boy's expression. He stood close enough to his mother to be claimed by her, but not by the house behind them. Price cleared his throat and began to read. The 3rd of June, 1892. Household provision transferred through the West account. Tuition for J.B. to continue under private arrangement. No public entry. He paused, then turned the page. The 14th of September, 1892. Summer house repairs to remain separate. Child not to be brought through main rooms when guests are present. Helen shut her eyes. Not dramatically, not for attention, only for one beat, as though the sentence had reached a part of her she had no defense for. Vivian sat down very slowly, like a woman who no longer trusted her legs. Robert leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, but Annie had begun to understand something about adults. The harder they folded themselves up, the less safe they felt. Price read again. The 22nd of December, 1893. Additional allowance to Mara Bell for discretion and quiet accommodation. Staff instructed not to discuss the boy's parentage. The words seemed to lower the ceiling of the room. No one spoke. No one needed to. The entries were doing something worse than revealing a scandal. They were revealing a routine, a practice, a whole family machine built around keeping one child near enough to supervise and far enough to deny. Annie looked down at her own gloved hands resting in her lap. She was no longer cold from the lawn, but she could still feel the dampness of that hidden chamber in her mind. The smell of old paper, the cold stone steps, the thought of a boy once living on the edge of that house while everyone upstairs practiced calling him something else. Price turned another page. The 7th of February, 1894. Elias requests formal acknowledgement postponed. Mrs. Halbrook refuses. States the matter would ruin the standing of all legitimate children. There it was. Not just silence, not just shame, choice. Samuel Pike let out a breath so low Annie barely heard it. Charles's face had gone very still. Annie watched him carefully. At first, she had thought of him only as the wealthy man at the center of the room, the man everyone else listened to even when they disagreed. Then she had begun to see him as a son of the house, someone standing inside a legacy he had not built but still had to answer for. Now she saw something else. The burden of realizing that the family stories handed down to him had been edited long before they ever reached his generation. Helen spoke first. "So they all knew," she said. Price did not look up from the page. At least some of them did. Vivian's voice came thin and brittle. "Some women in those days had no power in such matters." "No," Helen said quietly. "But they had enough power to decide whether a child entered by the front door." Vivian turned to her sharply, as though she had been struck. Robert laughed once, but there was no confidence in it. "So that's it? A century-old hypocrisy. And now we're meant to pretend the whole house is cursed?" Annie looked at him before anyone else answered. It surprised her that grown people so often confused accusation with inconvenience. Robert seemed angry not because the entries were cruel, but because they were becoming impossible to dismiss. Price turned to a later section, his brow tightening as he scanned the dates. "The boy ages through the book," he said. "Early schooling, clothing, medical fees. Then, what?" Charles asked. Price looked up. "His surname changes in the outside records, but the account line doesn't. He is still being funded from the same private source." "Which means," Helen asked, "which means he was never forgotten," Annie said softly. Every adult looked at her again. She had not meant to interrupt. But once she heard the pattern, she could not unhear it. Price studied her face, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is likely true." Annie looked at the photograph again. Not forgotten. Managed. Her grandfather had once told her that there were families who mistreated people openly, and families who did it politely. The second kind often thought themselves better because no one raised their voice, but dignity denied and a whisper still left the same bruise. Price resumed. "The 4th of August, 1898. James to begin work under Mr. Tolland at the Philadelphia office when of proper age. No use of family name. Advancement to depend on merit and silence." Robert's mouth twisted. "Well, there you are. They provided for him." Samuel looked at him with something like sorrow. "That is not provision, sir. That is management." Robert's eyes flashed. "You are forgetting yourself." "No," Samuel said, "only remembering too much." Charles did not stop Samuel. That was another change Annie noticed. At the beginning of the day, every sentence in the room had passed through rank before being allowed to matter. Now truth was coming from the old butler, the servant's child, the wife, the lawyer, whoever could still bear to say what the papers plainly showed. The hierarchy was still there, of course. Rooms like this did not lose centuries in an afternoon. But it had cracked. Price reached the final quarter of the ledger and slowed. "These entries become sparse," he said. "Fewer expenses, fewer notes." Then, his finger stopped on one line. "There's a transfer." Charles leaned in. "Read it. The 11th of March, 1902. Settlement arranged through intermediary trust. J.B. To receive title to western parcel upon maturity, provided no claim is raised against the principal estate and no public challenge is made to household legitimacy." Helen stared at him. "They paid him off." Vivian's eyes flew to the photograph as if it might defend itself, or protected him from scandal. Helen turned to her. "There is no kindness in forcing a person to accept less than his name in exchange for peace." The sentence settled in the room like judgment. Annie did not understand every legal part of it, but she understood the shape. They had offered the boy land instead of belonging, money instead of truth, a place to live, perhaps, but not a place to stand. And somewhere in the center of that trade sat the ugliest thing of all, the expectation that he should be grateful. Price turned one more page. This time he did not read immediately. "What is it?" Charles asked. The lawyer's voice changed when he answered. "There is a notation in a different hand. Later. Much later." "Whose?" "I'm not sure yet." "Read it." Price did. He kept his word better than we kept ours. The parcel passed. The name did not. His children were told less than he was promised. Let whoever finds this know. The debt was not paid. It was only delayed. The room went silent in a new way. Not with dread now. With recognition. Debt. Not legal debt only. Not financial debt. Moral debt. Inherited and polished and passed down under better tablecloths until everybody forgot what it had been for in the first place. Annie felt her mother's hand return to her shoulder. Lila had barely spoken in the last hour. But Annie could feel the meaning in that touch. Not just pride, not just protection, a kind of grief. The grief women carried when they saw history repeat itself in manners rather than in names. Charles straightened slowly. His children, he said. Price nodded, which means the line continued. Robert pushed back from the table. This is getting absurd again. If there are descendants somewhere, what then? We redraw the family tree, rewrite wills, hand over the estate because a dead branch left a bitter note in the margins? Charles turned toward him with a calm so cold it stopped the room. No, he said. We stop lying about what the estate was built on. Robert held his stare for a moment, then looked away first. Annie glanced back at the photograph. Mara and James. Summer house. Iten Babai Joshar. For the first time all day, she did not feel only the thrill of solving something. She felt the sorrow inside it. The longness of the wrong. How many dinners had been served in that house while some version of this truth lived just outside the main rooms? How many holidays, funerals, weddings, toasts? How many times had people chosen comfort over courage and still called themselves respectable? Samuel was the one who gave voice to what the room had begun to know. If the debt was delayed, he said quietly, then someone intended it to be collected. Price looked down at the hidden letter, the notebook, the ledgers, the photograph, then at Annie, then at Charles. I believe, he said, we have not yet reached the true purpose of Charles's inheritance condition. This was never just about who could decipher the record. Charles looked at the papers spread across the table like the bones of a second family history laid bare. No, he said, it was about who in this house could still bear the truth long enough to do something with it. And that, Annie realized, was worse than any secret, because secrets only asked to be found. Truth asked to be answered. For several moments after Charles spoke, no one moved. The papers lay across the walnut table like a second inheritance no one had wanted but everyone now had to touch. The hidden letter, the notebook, the survey map, the photograph of Mara Bell and her son. The ledger opened to the line that had changed the room more than any accusation could have done. The debt was not paid. It was only delayed. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. What remained at the windows was a flat, silver light that made the library feel suspended outside ordinary time. The fire snapped once in the grate, and the sound seemed too small for the weight now pressing on the room. Charles stood at the head of the table, hands braced on the polished wood. No, he said again, quieter this time. It was about who in this house could still bear the truth long enough to do something with it. Robert gave a short, tired laugh, but the anger in it had begun to fray around the edges. And what exactly does do something with it mean? We've uncovered an old disgrace, yes. We've all been properly horrified. Does that satisfy the record, or do we go on until the family is reduced to a public cautionary tale? Helen turned toward him. You are still asking the wrong question, and you've become very fond of the right one, apparently. No, she said. I've become tired of mistaking silence for dignity. Vivian pushed back from the table and crossed to the window, where she stood with her back half turned to the rest of them. If there are descendants, she said, not looking at anyone, and if what the ledger says is true, then this house withheld a name, not simply money. Money can be repaid, a name cannot. Samuel Pike, still standing near the library doors, lowered his head slightly. That is often why people choose money, ma'am. No one disputed that. Annie sat very still in the high-backed chair beside the table. Her feet still did not reach the floor. Her coat had been removed when they came back inside, but she could still feel the damp afternoon in her bones, the smell of turned earth and old paper clinging to memory. She looked again at the photograph. Mara Bell's face was solemn, unadorned by sentiment. The boy beside her, James, stood with the wary stillness Annie had seen in children who understood too early that being tolerated was not the same as being welcomed. She could not stop thinking of the line from the ledger. No public challenge is made to household legitimacy. Her grandfather had once told her that grown people often built very fine sentences around ugly choices. It did not make the choices cleaner, only harder to name. Price removed his glasses and polished them with a folded handkerchief before setting them back on his nose. It was the kind of gesture older men made when they needed a few seconds to think without looking as if they needed them. There is still the sealed envelope from the compartment, he said. Every eye shifted to the tin box. He was right. In all the movement between lawn and library, argument and revelation, the plain sealed envelope had remained untouched. Lying beside the notebook as though waiting for its proper moment, Charles straightened slightly. "Open it." Price reached for the envelope, then paused. The seal is waxed, though cracked with age. Initialed, but not addressed. "Can you identify the hand?" He held it up toward the lamplight. "Not from the outside. The initials appear to be E.H. Elias," Helen said. "Most likely." Robert sank into his chair with a look of weary contempt. "Wonderful." Another sermon from the grave. Charles did not look at him. "Open it, Edwin." The wax gave way with a brittle snap. Price slid a folded sheet from the envelope and another smaller paper tucked behind it. His expression changed almost immediately. "What is it?" Charles asked. Price did not answer at once. He read the first lines silently, then the next, and Annie saw something pass across his face she had not yet seen there all day. Not doubt, not caution, recognition. He looked up. "This is not from Elias." The room tightened. "Whose is it?" Helen asked. Price lifted the page slightly. "It is from your father, Charles. Dated 19 years ago." Vivian turned from the window. "My father?" "Yes." Charles held out a hand. "Read it." Price obeyed. "If this reaches the next generation and the old matter remains unresolved, let it be known I lacked the courage my grandfather had hoped for in those who came after him. I found the ledger. I found the photograph. I found enough to know the debt remained. I did nothing. I told myself timing, reputation, and legal complexity excused delay. They did not. No one spoke. Charles's face did not visibly move, but Annie could feel the blow of it all the same. The wrong had not only belonged to great-grandparents and sepia photographs. It had reached into living memory, into fathers, into choices recent enough to still carry the heat of shame. Price continued, "If my son Charles is the one hearing this, then I ask him not for forgiveness but for action. He has more steel than I did. If my daughter Vivian hears it, let her understand that what our mother called protection was often fear dressed for supper. If Robert hears it, let him learn, if it is not too late, that inheritance is not ownership without conscience." Robert shot to his feet. "That is outrageous." Price kept reading. "And if the papers are found by someone outside our blood, then God help us, because that will mean the family once again required an outsider to tell it the truth." The sentence fell straight into the center of the room and stayed there. Annie did not look up immediately. She did not need to. She could feel every adult in the library becoming aware of her all over again. Not as a curiosity this time, not as a servant's child who had stumbled into something beyond her station, but as living proof of the sentence just read aloud. Helen was the first to break. She let out one breath that sounded almost like a laugh and almost like grief. "Well," she said softly, "at least the man knew his family." Vivian sat down again very carefully, as if the strength had gone out of her knees. Her face had changed. Some of the old defensiveness remained, but it was now mixed with something raw. Annie thought it might be humiliation, or perhaps the pain of having one's mother named in a truth one could not deny. Charles said, "What's the second paper?" Price looked down at the smaller folded sheet. "It appears to be an instruction note. Also from your father. Read it." Price unfolded it. The western parcel was not the true settlement. It was the mask for one. The real corrective instrument was drafted but never filed. I placed it where Charles would think to look if he ever chose truth over peace. In the cedar box beneath my mother's pianoforte bench. He alone will know which key opens it. Helen looked up sharply. The music room. Samuel's head turned toward the far side of the house by instinct. "The Steinway bench, sir?" Charles nodded slowly. "My grandmother's." Robert stared. "There's another document?" Price lowered the note. "If this is accurate, yes." Robert laughed again, but now it sounded dangerously close to panic. "This is insanity. A century of hidden children and secret ledgers and pianos with legal documents tucked under the seat? At what point does this become theater instead of law? At the point," Price said quietly, "when there is no paper at the end of it. Until then, it remains both." Annie looked up at Charles. He had gone very still again, but not in the same way as before. This stillness was decision-forming. She understood that look now. It had appeared in him each time the room reached a place where truth demanded not just hearing but movement. She glanced at the tin box once more. "There's more," she said. Price looked down. "More?" Annie pointed, not at the papers, but at the box itself. The bottom. Everyone stared at her. "It's too thick," she said. "For what was in it?" Samuel stepped closer at once. Price lifted the tin box, weighed it in both hands, then turned it over. At first there seemed to be nothing but dust and age. Then Charles took the box from him, ran his thumb along the inside seam, and pressed. A hidden panel slipped loose. Helen whispered, "No." Inside the false bottom lay a single item wrapped in dark blue cloth. Samuel unfolded it gently. It was a small iron key. Not ornate, not decorative. Plain, strong, old. Charles looked at it for one long second before taking it into his hand. "My grandmother kept the bench locked," he said quietly. "Always." Annie saw it then, not merely surprise, not merely family shame, but memory rearranging itself behind his eyes. Childhood details returning with new meaning. A piano lesson, a forbidden drawer, an old woman guarding music, and something else besides. Price gathered the father's note, the hidden letter, and the ledger into a neat stack. Then the next step is obvious. Vivian looked at Charles. "If that corrective instrument exists, what does it change?" Price answered before he could. "Potentially everything." Robert muttered. "Convenient." "No," Helen said, her voice steady now. "Consequential." Charles closed his hand around the iron key. For the first time all day, Annie saw not just the wealthy man at the center of the room or the son inheriting old guilt, but the person his father had named directly, the one expected to choose. He looked at Annie then, not for permission, not for proof, for witness. She held his gaze without flinching, and in the quiet that followed, with the hidden key in his palm and his family seated among papers that had already undone half the life they thought they knew, Charles said the only thing left to say. "We're going to the music room." The music room sat at the eastern end of Halbrook House, where the afternoon light, even on gray days, found its way through tall windows and settled over polished wood as if the room had been built for memory before music. By the time they entered, the house felt different, not louder. If anything, quieter. But the quiet had changed shape. Earlier that morning it had been the stillness of rank. The polished silence of people who knew how to keep family matters behind good doors and expensive curtains. Now, it was something else entirely. A strained, waiting quiet. The kind that comes after too many sealed things have already been opened. The grand piano stood near the far windows, black and gleaming, its long lid closed. A vase of white lilies rested on the instrument, left there after the funeral, their scent soft and faintly sweet in the cold air. The bench before it was cedar, narrow and elegantly old, its carved legs dark with age. Annie could see immediately that the bench had once been beautiful in the way things become beautiful when they are used for many years and touched with care, then later preserved by people more interested in keeping them than knowing them. Charles stopped a few feet from it. No one rushed past him, not even Robert. Price carried the father's note, the hidden letter, and the ledger under one arm. Helen stood close to the piano's far side, one hand resting lightly against the curved black edge as if the instrument itself might steady her. Vivian remained near the doorway, not refusing to come in, but not surrendering to the room either. Samuel Pike had brought one of the library lamps with him, its brass shade throwing a warm, focused light over the bench. Leela stayed near Annie, though this time there was no effort to keep her at the back. There was nowhere the back really existed anymore. Not after the library, not after the West Hall, not after the earth had opened and handed up a boy with no rightful place in the family story except the one truth had forced open for him. Charles turned the iron key over in his fingers. "For years," he said quietly, almost to himself, "my grandmother told us children not to touch that bench. She said it held music that had not yet earned young hands." Helen looked at him. "Did you believe her?" "When I was 8, yes." He gave the smallest, bitterest smile Annie had seen on him all day. "By 10, I thought she simply didn't trust us with expensive wood." Samuel's expression changed very slightly, into something like grief shaded by long hindsight. Older generations in houses like this often preferred metaphor. Sir. It sounded gentler than command. Or more noble than fear, Helen said. Charles did not answer. He stepped forward and knelt before the bench. Annie watched the movement carefully. There was something about seeing a man like Charles Halbrook kneel on the polished floor of his family's music room that made all the old arrangements of power seem briefly uncertain. Not gone. Not reversed, but unsettled. Kneeling changed a person. It placed them level with older things, hidden things, things that did not care for title. He ran his hand beneath the bench and felt along the underside until his fingers found the hidden lock. There, he said. Price came nearer, angling the lamp downward. The lock was small and nearly invisible from any ordinary height. Built flush into the wood with the arrogance of something designed to remain undiscovered unless discovery had been chosen. Charles inserted the iron key. For a second, nothing happened. Then he turned it. A soft internal click passed through the cedar bench. No one breathed. Samuel crouched beside him. There is a panel seam along the side, sir. Charles set his hand against the carved edge and pressed. A narrow compartment slid open beneath the seat. Inside lay a flat leather portfolio, dark with age but still intact, and beneath it a small velvet pouch tied with braided cord. Vivian made a sound in her throat, not quite a gasp, not quite refusal. Robert muttered something Annie did not fully catch, though she heard the shape of disbelief inside it. Price held out his hand. May I? Charles looked down at the open compartment for a long moment before nodding. Price lifted the leather portfolio first and laid it on the piano bench under the lamp. Helen took one involuntary step closer. Samuel drew back only enough to give the others room. Annie leaned forward, but Lila's hand touched her shoulder gently and kept her from crowding the adults too far. The old portfolio opened with the dry softness of well-kept leather. Inside was a single document packet tied with faded green ribbon and a folded cover letter on cream paper, its edges gone brittle. Price read the first line in silence, then the second. His mouth tightened. What is it? Charles asked. Price looked up. The corrective instrument. Helen's hand pressed more firmly against the piano. Robert let out a sharp breath. Read it. Price unfolded the cover letter. To be filed should the family ever choose conscience over comfort. The sentence landed in the room with terrible grace. Price read on. This instrument is drafted to recognize the line of James Bell, son of Elias Halbrook, as carrying lawful moral claim upon the Western Trust and educational revenues formerly disguised as discretionary household settlement. I lacked the courage to file it in my own lifetime. If you hold this now, then courage has arrived either too late or through the wrong door. Use it anyway. Helen looked away. Vivian sank into the nearest chair without seeming to decide to do so. The color had left her face almost completely. Robert stood with his jaw set hard, but Annie could see now that his anger was no longer aimed outward. It had turned defensive, cramped by the sudden knowledge that the family had not merely hidden something shameful, but had preserved, in careful legal form, the very remedy they never chose to enact. Charles said nothing. Price set down the cover letter and carefully unfolded the legal instrument itself. Several pages, witnessed but never filed, complete with trust language, parcel descriptions, a line of succession, and provisions for descendants through James Bell's issue. The legal phrasing was dense and formal, but Annie did not need to understand every sentence to know what it meant. This was not apology. This was structure. Her grandfather had always said real power showed itself not when someone admitted they had done wrong, but when they wrote down exactly what right would have cost and then refused to pay it. Price read the most important sections aloud. The western parcel, once offered as a hush settlement, was to be absorbed into a restored trust. Educational revenues that had remained under Halbrook control were to be redirected. Descendants of James Bell were to be identified and recognized. The instrument did not place them at the head of the principal estate, but neither did it leave them nameless at the edge. It created standing, claim, record. When Price finished, the room was so quiet Annie could hear the fire settling in the next room and the soft tap of rainwater dripping from the terrace gutters outside. Finally, Robert spoke. This was never filed, he said. That matters. Price did not look at him. Legally, yes. Morally, perhaps even more. Robert stepped closer. Then we are dealing with intent. not binding change. No, Charles said at last. His voice was calm, but calm in him had become more dangerous as the day wore on. We are dealing with a family that knew the right thing in exact detail and chose, over and over, not to do it. Robert opened his mouth, then shut it. Vivian stared at the document on the bench. My father found this. He knew. Yes, Helen said quietly. And he left it for Charles. Which means he knew who among you might actually act. That struck hard enough to make Vivian flinch. Samuel stepped forward only then, his eyes on the pages. Sir, he said, there is still the pouch. They had almost forgotten it. Charles looked down at the small velvet bundle still lying in the compartment and picked it up himself. The cord gave way easily under his fingers. He tipped the contents into his palm. A signet ring, not elaborate, but unmistakably old. Gold, worn thin at the edges, the Halbrook crest engraved on the face. Inside the band, in smaller letters nearly erased by time, was a single inscription for J. H. When truth can bear his name. Annie stared, not J.B. Inga. Price took the ring gently and looked from it to the document packet. James Halbrook, he said. Samuel closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Helen whispered, they knew. Vivian covered her mouth with her hand. Robert's voice came out rough. This proves only intention, not identity. No, Annie said softly before anyone else could answer. It proves they knew what they took. Every adult turned toward her. She did not mean to sound older. She was only telling the truth the way it had come to her. That was the strange thing about the whole day. No one had taught her the family's secrets. The papers had. They had unfolded themselves through the habits of people who thought hiding was the same as erasing. Charles looked at Annie for a long second, then back at the ring. Price closed the document packet with great care. There are now 3 separate classes of evidence, he said. The coded family record, the hidden correspondence and ledgers, and an unfiled corrective instrument supported by a family artifact naming the child as Halbrook. Helen folded her arms tightly across herself. But there was no coldness left in the gesture now. Only containment. What happens next? Price answered in the tone of a man returning, at last, to the thing he knew best. The instrument cannot undo history, but it can be used to reconstruct intended remedy. We identify descendants, establish chain, and determine what portion of the trust and associated revenues should have passed. The estate condition Charles created now has a measurable object. Charles's hand remained on the piano bench. The inheritance condition, he said, almost to himself. Annie looked up at him. All day the family had spoken as though the prize attached to the record were a matter of money, prestige, victory. Now, standing in the music room with the old ring and the unfiled remedy laid open beneath the lamp, Annie understood something deeper. The real test had never been who could solve the puzzle. It had been who, once they solved it, would refuse to look away. Charles straightened slowly, the signet ring glinting once in the lamplight before he closed his hand around it. Then he looked at Annie, and when he spoke, there was no distance left in his voice at all. You didn't just find what was hidden, he said. You found what this family owes. For a moment after Charles spoke, no one in the music room seemed capable of answering him. The words stayed there between the piano and the window light, heavier than anything else that had been said all day. You found what this family owes. Annie stood very still beside her mother. At 6 years old, she did not understand every part of what had just been uncovered. She did not know trust law, or estate corrections, or the long legal shadows that dead men could still cast through paper. But she understood owing. Children understood that word early. Owing meant something had been taken and not returned. It meant someone had been made to carry the cost of another person's comfort, and from the look on every adult face in that room, this debt had been growing interest for a very long time. Price laid the corrective instrument back inside the leather portfolio, but he did not tie the ribbon again. It was as though even his lawyer's instincts understood that nothing in Halbrook House could be tied shut again and called settled. Helen moved first. She crossed slowly to the window, then stopped there with one hand resting against the glass. Outside, the lawn still gleamed from the rain, and the bare branches beyond the terrace trembled in the cold wind. Annie watched Helen's reflection more than the woman herself. Reflections sometimes told the truth adults did not say aloud. She was told to accept less than a name, Helen said quietly. Maribel. Then the boy was told to accept less than a place. Then his children were expected to accept less than a history. Vivian gave a small, strained sound. Helen, no. Helen turned, and now there was nothing polished in her voice at all. No, Vivian. We have spent the whole day calling this complicated because that is the nicer word. It wasn't complicated. It was cruel. It was chosen. Again and again. Vivian sat in the chair nearest the piano bench, one hand pressed against her temple. She looked suddenly tired in a way Annie had never seen in rich women before. Not tired from work, tired from the collapse of something they had built themselves upon. My mother knew, Vivian said softly. My father knew. Charles's father knew. And everyone told themselves the next generation would be the one to fix it. She let out a bitter breath. That is how respectable people pass down cowardice, wrapped in good intentions. Samuel Pike lowered his eyes, but not in submission, more in sorrow. Price gathered the photograph and set it carefully beside the portfolio. Then the question becomes immediate, he said. The inheritance condition Charles established depends on correct interpretation of the record. We now have that interpretation, along with corroborating evidence and an unfiled corrective instrument. The estate requires a determination. Robert let out a sharp laugh. At last. We're back to what this has all really been about. Charles turned toward him. No, he said. You are. The room went quiet again. Robert held his brother's stare for a few seconds, then looked away. Annie noticed that he did it more often now. At the beginning of the day, he had spoken as if certainty belonged to him. Now certainty seemed to cost him too much to maintain. Price cleared his throat. The estate condition was specific. The individual who correctly interpreted the record would receive the discretionary inheritance attached to the directive. Robert's head came up. Surely we are not about to pretend that means a 6-year-old child from the servant quarters inherits part of the Halbrook estate. Lila stiffened at once. Annie felt her mother's hand close around her shoulder. Not painfully, but with the kind of immediate instinct that comes when a mother wants to shield her child from a room turning ugly again. For a second, Annie thought Lila might pull her backward, out of sight. Back toward the old places where women like her survived by disappearing before men chose to make them smaller. Instead, Lila stayed where she was. She did not speak. She did not retreat. She simply kept her hand on Annie's shoulder. And in that silence, Charles answered, That is exactly what the condition means. Robert stared at him. Vivian looked up sharply. Helen turned fully from the window. Even Price, who had likely seen this conclusion coming 2 steps before anyone else, seemed to let the sentence settle with proper weight before he spoke. Legally, Price said carefully, the language is clear. The record was not solved by a consultant, a relative, or a scholar under contract. It was solved by Annie Brooks. Robert barked out a laugh that bordered on disbelief. This is insane. No, Helen said. It's embarrassing. There's a difference. Robert rounded on her. You would be comfortable with this? Handing over family inheritance to the daughter of a housekeeper because she happened to be in the room when a dead man's theatrical puzzle was opened? Happened? Helen repeated. She was the only person in the room who actually saw it. That struck harder than Annie expected. Not because Helen had raised her voice, but because she had not. The quiet truth in the sentence seemed to hurt the adults more than anger ever could. Price opened the father's note again and glanced down at it. There is also the matter of intent within the note from Charles's father, he said. If the truth came through someone outside the family bloodline, it was to be taken as its own indictment. That language strengthens, rather than weakens, the legitimacy of Annie's role. Vivian looked at Annie for a long moment. It was not a kind look exactly. Not yet. But it had lost contempt. It had become something more difficult and perhaps more honest. The look of someone raised to see hierarchy as natural, who now had to confront the possibility that character, intelligence, and courage had entered the room in a form her upbringing had trained her not to value. She's 6, Vivian said. Yes, Charles replied. That is absurd. No, Lila said softly. Every face turned toward her. Lila swallowed once. Annie could feel the tremor in the hand resting on her shoulder. But when her mother spoke again, Her voice stayed even. What's absurd is that every grown person in this house missed what a 6-year-old child was able to hear because none of you thought she mattered enough to pay attention to. The sentence seemed to shake the room more than any legal conclusion had done. Lila looked as startled by her own words as anyone else. But once they were out, she did not take them back. Robert's face hardened. "Mind your place." Charles's voice cut in before Lila could answer. "Her place today is the truth. That is more than I can say for everyone in this room." Robert fell silent. Annie looked up at her mother with something close to wonder. Lila had spent the entire morning moving carefully through spaces designed to remind her of what was not hers. Yet now, in the music room of one of the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania, she had said the simplest and most dangerous thing of all, the truth without apology. Samuel Pike gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but Annie saw it. Price turned back to the estate papers. "The discretionary inheritance attached to the condition has not yet been announced in detail," he said. "Charles requested that I withhold the amount and form until the record had been solved." Helen looked at Charles. "You knew all along that the answer might force this outcome." Charles glanced at Annie before answering. "I knew the answer would tell me who in this house could still be trusted with the truth." "And now?" Charles's expression did not soften, but something in it grew clearer. "Now I know." He turned to Price. "Tell them." Price removed a sealed page from the estate file he had been carrying since morning and opened it beneath the lamp. "The discretionary inheritance consists of 3 components," he said. "First, a direct education trust in the recipient's name, fully funded through university and any specialized study thereafter. Second, a lifetime housing stipend held in protective structure until the recipient reaches legal adulthood. Third, immediate transfer of the restored Western educational revenues, once lawfully reconstructed, into a named charitable foundation under the recipient's future advisory authority." Even Robert stopped trying to hide his shock. Vivian sat back slowly. Helen's brows lifted, though not in objection. Samuel's face changed in a way Annie could not fully read at first. Then she understood it. Relief, not for the money, for the intention. Charles had not built a prize. He had built an answer. Lila whispered, "Oh Lord." Annie looked up at her mother, confused more by the adult's expressions than by the words themselves. She knew school, she knew houses. She did not yet know what a foundation was, but she understood from the room that it meant something large and lasting. Robert found his voice first. "This is madness. You would hand all of that to a child who has no connection to this family." Annie looked down at the ring, still lying on the bench beside the portfolio. No connection. The phrase sounded wrong now in a room full of hidden names, denied children, buried ledgers, and one dead family trying too late to become decent. But before she could even think to say anything, Helen did. "No," Helen said. "He would hand it to the one person who actually honored the test." Silence followed. Then Charles walked to Annie. He did not kneel this time, but he came close enough that she did not have to tilt her head too far to see his face. "You will not need to understand all of this today," he said to her gently. "That isn't your burden." Annie nodded, though she still felt the room pressing in around her. He looked at Lila then. "But I would like your permission, if you will allow it, to have Edwin prepare the formal record, naming Annie as the rightful recipient under the inheritance condition." Lila's eyes filled at once, though she blinked the tears back before they could fall. Annie had never seen her mother cry in front of strangers. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely steady. Then she corrected herself. Not because she had forgotten manners, but because something in the day had shifted enough to make honesty possible. "Yes, if it protects her." "It will," Price said. Charles nodded. "It will." Vivian looked down at her folded hands. Robert looked as though he had bitten down on something bitter and found it impossible to spit out. Helen rested one hand on the piano and let out a long breath. Samuel Pike, standing near the door with the lamp glow on one side of his lined face, said quietly, "Then perhaps for once this house has chosen the right child." No one answered him. They didn't need to, because everyone in the room knew he was right. By the time they returned to the library, the house seemed to know something irreversible had happened. It was not in any single sound. The servants still moved quietly in the halls. The grandfather clock still marked the hour with solemn certainty. The fire still gave off its steady heat beneath the carved mantel, but Halbrook House had lost the polished calm it had worn so naturally that morning. Its rooms no longer felt like places built to hold authority. They felt like places built to hold memory. And memory, Annie was learning, had far less respect for rank than people did. Edwin Price asked that no one disturb the library for the next hour. It was the first clear order he had given all day that no one challenged. The old papers were brought back from the music room and laid out again on the walnut table with a care that had become almost reverent. The coded family record remained open at one end. Beside it sat the hidden letter from Elias Halbrook, the notebook, the ledgers from the underground chamber, the photograph of Mara Bell and her son James, the unfiled corrective instrument, and the signet ring that proved what the family had denied in every polite way available to them. Price arranged them in sequence, not for beauty, but for truth. One led to another. One explained another. The lie had not been random. It had been maintained. Charles remained standing while Price prepared the formal record. Lila stayed near Annie's chair, though the word chair hardly fit what it had become. That high-backed seat by the table was no longer where a servant's child had been tolerated for convenience. It had become the place from which the truth had entered the room. Annie did not know whether anyone else felt that. But she did. Helen sat across from her, quieter now than at any point that day. Not cold, not distant, quiet in the way of someone measuring herself against something she had not expected to admire. Vivian had not asked to leave. That mattered more than Annie might have expected. The older woman looked tired, and not in the refined, elegant manner of people who complained of fatigue while living protected lives. She looked stripped of something. Pride, perhaps, or the illusion that family dignity could be kept clean simply by speaking softly enough. Robert had moved to the far side of the room near the windows. He stood there with one hand in his pocket and the other braced at his hip, as if he could still hold himself apart from what was happening. But Annie knew by now that distance was not the same as freedom. The truth had a way of crossing rooms without asking permission. Price dipped his pen and began. "For the record," he said, his voice as formal as church, "this memorandum is entered under the authority of the Halbrook estate, supplemental directive, dated and executed by Charles Halbrook." He paused to let the sentence settle into the page. The directive conditioned the release of a discretionary inheritance upon the correct interpretation of the coded family record held in the Halbrook archives. Said record has now been interpreted through corroborated analysis supported by the following materials: concealed correspondence, private household accounts, recovered photographic evidence, underground trust ledgers, and an unfiled corrective instrument naming the line of James Halbrook, formerly recorded as James Bell. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room. Annie watched his hand move. Her grandfather had always loved hands. Not in a sentimental way, in a scholar's way. He used to say a person's hands told on them. Some hands only grabbed. Some only performed. Some held old things as though old things had no feelings at all. Mr. Price's hands, Annie thought, were the kind that believed paper mattered because lives did. Price looked up briefly. The individual who first and correctly identified the structural logic of the coded record, led the recovery path to supporting evidence, and provided the first accurate oral interpretation, is Annie Brooks. He said her name cleanly, not as an interruption, not as an apology, not as something strange in his mouth. Lila's hand came to rest on Annie's shoulder again. Annie looked up at her mother. Lila's chin was raised, but her eyes were bright with tears she was still refusing to let fall. Annie understood that too. Some women had not been allowed enough softness in life to trust it, even when it finally arrived. Robert turned from the window. "This is still madness." No one answered him immediately. That silence was more devastating than any rebuke. At last, Charles did speak, but his tone had changed from the colder authority of earlier. There was iron still, but something else too. Weariness, perhaps, or responsibility fully accepted. "No, Robert," he said. Madness was leaving this rot in the walls and calling it tradition. Robert laughed once, but the sound broke before it finished. "So that's what this is now? A moral cleansing? You think a few old ledgers and one remarkable child give you the right to rewrite the shape of the family? No. Helen said, lifting her eyes to him. The family rewrote itself the day it chose cowardice. This is the first honest draft since. The sentence left Robert with nowhere to go. He looked toward Vivian instead, as if hoping blood would rescue him where argument no longer could. Vivian met his gaze, then lowered her eyes. I won't help you defend this anymore, she said quietly. Robert stared at her. You're serious? Yes. She isn't one of us. Annie did not move, but she felt the room tighten around those words. It was Lila who answered first. No, she said softly. That's been the trouble all day, hasn't it? You keep deciding who counts before you've even learned who they are. Robert turned toward her with open contempt. You should be grateful your daughter is being rewarded. Don't mistake that for equality. The room froze. Annie felt her mother's body go still behind her. Then Charles stepped away from the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You will not speak to her like that in my house. Robert gave a short, disbelieving breath. Your house? Yes. Charles's expression did not shift. Mine. And if you cannot tell the difference between gratitude and dignity, then you have learned nothing from this day. For the first time, Robert did not answer at all. He looked from Charles to Annie, then to the papers spread on the table, and Annie saw it clearly. Not remorse, not yet, perhaps not ever, but defeat, the kind that comes when a person realizes the room has stopped agreeing with the story they tell about themselves. Price resumed writing. He recorded the educational trust, the lifetime housing structure, the restored Western revenues to be reconstructed and directed toward a future charitable foundation. He recorded Annie's role not as accident, not as witness alone, but as rightful recipient under the estate condition. Then he did something Annie had not expected. He drew a second page toward him. What is that? Charles asked. A supplementary recommendation, Price said. Not legally required. Morally required, I think. He began to write again. It is further recommended that a formal genealogical search be initiated at estate expense to identify living descendants of James Halbrook, and that all records connected to their exclusion be preserved, disclosed, and made available to counsel. Silence has already cost enough. Samuel Pike closed his eyes briefly. Helen looked at Price with quiet approval. Vivian let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender and almost like relief. Charles nodded. Include it. Price did. Annie looked back at the photograph. Mara and James. Summer house. Etienne Babai Joshar. That little family had once been hidden so carefully that even the house itself had been used against them. Its back rooms, its side entrances, its false settlements, its buried ledgers, its locked bench. Yet now their names sat on the same table as the Halbrook crest, in the same light, before the same witnesses. Annie did not know if that could heal anything, but she knew it mattered. Samuel stepped forward then, slowly, as though approaching an altar. Sir, he said to Charles, there is one more thing. Charles looked at him. Yes? The old butler glanced toward Annie before speaking. The house staff will hear something by evening, whether we wish it or not. A day like this does not stay inside walls. I would ask permission to tell them only this, that the child who found the truth is to be treated with respect, and so is her mother. Lila looked stunned. Charles did not hesitate. You have it. Samuel gave a small nod. Thank you, sir. That simple exchange touched Annie more deeply than the money talk had. Children knew the difference between being praised in front of important people and being made safe in the ordinary rooms where life actually happened. Price finished the final line and sanded the page. Then he looked at Annie. I need your full name, he said. She blinked. Annie Brooks. He waited. Pen poised. And how old are you, Miss Brooks? 6. The smallest smile touched his tired face. Yes. I imagine the record will note that. He wrote it down. Annie Brooks, age 6. The words seemed almost too small for what the day had become. Yet perhaps that was fitting. Her grandfather had always said history liked plain ink better than grand speeches. When Price was done, he set the pen aside and turned the document toward Charles. Charles signed first. Then Price signed as witness. Helen signed. Vivian signed after a long pause. Samuel signed with a steady hand when asked to attest to the recovery of the hidden materials. Lila did not sign the estate record, but Price prepared a separate acknowledgement for her consent regarding Annie's protective trust. And when she took the pen, Her hand trembled only once before becoming still. Robert was offered the page. He looked at it for a long time. Finally, he said, "I won't bless a humiliation," Charles answered. "Then don't mistake your refusal for power." Robert set the paper down unsigned. No one begged him. No one argued. The room simply moved on without him. And that, Annie thought, was how old power finally began to weaken, not when it was shouted down, but when truth made it unnecessary. As the last page dried on the table, the library felt changed again. Not healed, not gentle, but honest. And in that honesty, something rare and almost holy had appeared in Halbrook House for the first time in generations. A beginning. By evening, Halbrook House had gone quiet in a way Annie had never heard before. Not the careful quiet of rich people who expected the world to lower its voice around them. Not the funeral quiet from 2 days earlier, when grief had been arranged among flowers, black coats, and polished condolences. This was something else. A quieter quiet, a truthful one. The kind that comes after a room has finally stopped pretending. The fire in the library had burned low again. The formal papers lay drying on the walnut table, their ink set, their language fixed, their consequences no longer waiting for permission to become real. Samuel Pike had seen to it that the hidden letter, the ledgers, the photograph, the corrective instrument, and the family record were placed into protective folders until proper archival boxes could be brought down in the morning. Edwin Price had stayed longer than anyone expected, making calls in the study, beginning the first legal steps before anyone in the family could lose their nerve overnight. Helen had left quietly, not out of indifference, Annie thought, but because some people needed solitude to let the truth settle into the places where pride used to live. Vivian had gone upstairs without another argument. Robert had gone out the front door. No one asked where. Lila sat now in one of the smaller chairs near the library hearth, her coat folded across her lap, her hands resting on it as though she still did not trust this day enough to unclench. Annie sat on the rug at her feet, not because anyone had sent her there, but because the room at last felt warm enough, safe enough, for a child to sit where children naturally did. That, more than the papers and signatures and old ledgers, seemed to Annie the strangest change of all. Charles stood by the mantel, looking down into the coals. Without the others around him, he looked less like the master of the house and more like what he truly was. A man left standing in the wreckage of an inheritance that had become clearer, uglier, and more demanding than he had imagined when the morning began. He still wore authority like a well-made coat, but now it sat more honestly on him. Annie had learned in a single day that authority and goodness were not the same thing. Some people had one and not the other. The rare ones tried to use the first in service of the second. Samuel entered with a tray a moment later. Soup, tea, thick slices of buttered bread, and a plate of apples cut neatly into crescents. He set it down on the low table between them with the same gravity he had given the hidden documents, which somehow made Annie want to smile. Grown people who understood care often did it through small arrangements. "You've had almost nothing since morning," he said. Lila blinked as if only just remembering that hunger belonged to ordinary life and had not been cancelled by history. "Thank you, Mr. Pike. My pleasure." He glanced at Annie. "Miss Brooks, I took the liberty of adding honey to the tea. It seemed the right sort of evening for it." Annie looked up at him. "Thank you." Samuel inclined his head, then looked toward Charles. "I've spoken to the staff, sir." Charles turned. "And?" "I told them what needed telling." A faint, tired softness came into the old man's expression. "There will be no gossip directed at Miss Brooks or her mother while I still draw breath in this house." Lila's eyes filled again, though she looked down quickly at the coat in her lap. Charles nodded once. "Good." Samuel hesitated, then added, "The kitchen has also sent up a strawberry jam cake from the tea tray. Miss Annie shouldn't be made to solve a century of family cowardice on an empty stomach." That brought the first real smile Annie had seen from Charles all day. "Agreed." When Samuel left, the room fell into a gentler silence. Lila finally reached for the tea, but her hands still trembled a little. Annie noticed, because Annie noticed everything. She noticed how her mother kept glancing at the signed documents on the table and then away again, as if they might disappear if she trusted them too much. She noticed how Charles had not yet removed the signet ring from his pocket, how his hand went there once, unconsciously, as if checking that the weight of the day remained where he had placed it. She noticed how the house, for all its size and old grandeur, seemed almost relieved. "Do you want some soup, baby?" Leela asked. Annie nodded. Lila handed her the bowl carefully, and Annie held it in both hands, breathing in the steam. Chicken, thyme, black pepper. Simple, warm, and real. Her grandfather had always said that after hard truths, people needed plain food. Nothing fancy. Something that reminded the body it was still here. Charles stepped away from the mantel at last and came to the table where the signed documents lay. "Edwin will return tomorrow morning," he said. "He's already contacting a genealogical firm in Philadelphia. Quietly, for now. We'll begin tracing James Halbrook's line properly." Lila looked up. "You really mean to do all of it?" It was not a question asked with challenge, more with wonder. "Yes," Charles said. "All of it." Lila lowered her eyes again. "A lot of people say the right thing when the room is watching." Charles stood still for a moment after she said it. Annie thought some men would have bristled. Another few hours ago, perhaps he might have. But the day had changed him too. "You're right," he said. "They do." Lila looked surprised that he had answered so plainly. He went on. "That's why I signed it in ink instead of saying it in sentiment." Annie liked that answer. It sounded like something Grandpa Joseph might have approved of. Charles turned then to Annie herself. "I imagine this has been a strange day for you." She looked up from her soup. "Yes, sir. Are you frightened?" Annie thought about it honestly. She was tired. She was full of thoughts too old for one day. She was not sure yet what a housing stipend meant or why adults became so small whenever truth cost them something. But frightened was not the right word. "No," she said. "Just full." Something changed in Charles's face then. Not amusement. Exactly. Recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "That seems right." He drew out one of the library chairs and sat across from her. Not at the head of the room now. Not above her. Just across. Lila watched that carefully. "I want you to hear this from me," he said. "What happens next will be handled by adults. Lawyers, records, trusts, schools, all of it. None of that is your burden. You've done more than enough." Annie stirred her soup once with the spoon. "But you'll still fix it?" Charles did not answer immediately, and Annie respected him for that too. Quick promises were easy. Measured ones cost more. "Yes," he said at last. "I will." Lila closed her eyes briefly, as if the sentence had found a place in her too raw to touch directly. Annie ate another spoonful of soup and then, because children often reached the heart of a matter while adults were still circling its edges, asked the thing she most needed to know. "Was James lonely?" The room went still. Charles lowered his eyes. Lila's hand came to rest gently on Annie's curls. For a moment, Annie thought perhaps no one would answer. Then Charles said, "I think he was. Because they kept him outside?" "Yes." Annie nodded, taking that in. "My grandpa said people can die from being unseen before they ever die from being poor." Lila looked down at her sharply, perhaps startled by the memory. Charles, however, only sat there, receiving it. "That sounds like a wise man," he said. He was. They were quiet for a while after that. Annie finished her soup. Samuel brought the jam cake and cut a small slice for her, which she ate slowly. The library grew darker outside the windows, but warmer inside. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed. Somewhere down the hall, the house settled into night. At last, Charles rose and walked to the walnut table. He picked up the photograph of Mara and James and looked at it one more time before setting it back down very carefully. Then he turned toward Annie. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think your grandfather would be proud of you." The words struck deeper than Annie expected. For the first time all day, her eyes stung. She did not cry. Not yet. But she held the edge of the bowl tighter and looked down at the rug until the feeling passed enough for her to breathe through it. When she finally looked up again, Charles was still standing there, waiting without pressing, which was another kind of kindness grown people rarely understood. "My grandpa said old things still speak," Annie said softly. "If someone loves them enough to listen." Charles glanced at the family record on the table, then at the signed papers beside it. "Yes," he said. And today, they did. Later, when the lamps were lowered, and Samuel walked Lila and Annie toward the smaller guest room that had been prepared for them, rather than the service quarters at the back. Annie looked once over her shoulder at the library. The walnut table, the fire gone softer now. The papers laid in order, the photograph no longer hidden. The truth, at last, with a place to sit. Halbrook House had not become good in a day. Houses did not change that quickly, especially houses built on silence. But one thing had changed, perhaps the thing that mattered most. In a family that had spent generations deciding which child could be seen and which one must stand at the edge of the room, a 6-year-old girl had been the one to make them look straight at what they owed. And this time, for once, the grown people had not looked away. This story reminds us that truth does not depend on age, status, or wealth. Sometimes the person who sees most clearly is the one everyone else has ignored. It also teaches that injustice does not disappear just because a family hides it behind silence, manners, or money. A wrong left unspoken can travel through generations, hurting people long after the first decision was made. The story asks the audience to look beyond appearances, to respect the dignity of every child, and to understand that real honor is not protecting a family's image, but having the courage to face the truth and make things right. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.